The air in the eastern wing of the estate still smelled of Arthur's final week. It was a suffocating blend of medicinal rubbing alcohol, stale lavender water, and the sharp metallic tang of the oxygen concentrator that had hummed beside his bed for 16 months. The rental company had wheeled the machine out 3 hours after the funeral service ended, leaving behind a rectangular patch of dust on the Belgian wool rug. Eleanor stood in the center of the master bedroom, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her black wool coat. Her fingers brushed against a small plastic cap, the lid to one of Arthur's liquid morphine bottles. She didn't take it out. Instead, she let her thumb trace the ridged plastic over and over, a rhythmic, mindless habit that kept her grounded in the quiet. Down the long, raw concrete hallway of the villa, the sharp click of designer loafers echoed. "Ellie?" It was Julian's voice. It had the smooth, projected quality of a man who spent his life speaking in glass-walled boardrooms, entirely unaccustomed to waiting for an answer. Eleanor didn't reply immediately. She waited, calculating the energy required to raise her voice against the hard, minimalist surfaces of the house versus the energy required to let him find her. She stood still, watching the gray light of the late afternoon fade over the manicured lawn outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian appeared in the doorway. He had already discarded his funeral tie. His charcoal gray dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he held a crystal tumbler containing 3 fingers of his late father's 25-year-old single malt scotch. "There you are," Julian said, taking a sip. He didn't look at her eyes. His gaze drifted to the empty space where the medical bed had stood. "The caterers are finally gone. Chloe is downstairs trying to sort out the flower arrangements. Honestly, the sheer volume of white lilies is giving her a migraine." "I will put them in the garage before they begin to rot," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, low, and entirely devoid of the performative grief that had characterized the funeral attendees. "Don't worry about it," Julian said, waving a hand dismissively. He walked further into the room, his eyes scanning the built-in walnut wardrobes. "We'll probably just hire a crew to clear the whole place out by the end of the week anyway. No sense in you breaking your back over dead flowers." Eleanor watched him. She noted the way he used the word "we." It was a quiet, deliberate word, heavy with ownership. For 4 years, while Arthur's kidneys failed and his mind slowly drifted into the fog of vascular dementia, Julian had been in Zurich, then London, then Milan. His communication had consisted of brief administrative emails sent to Eleanor's personal account, usually asking if Arthur's condition would prevent him from signing certain year-end tax documents. "The appraisers are coming on Wednesday," Julian continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, demanding sound. "I took the liberty of scheduling them. Chloe and I figured it's best to move quickly. The market for mid-century modern estates in this zip code is ridiculously hot right now, and frankly, neither of us has the time to fly back and forth to manage a lingering property." "I see," Eleanor said. She walked past him toward the ensuite bathroom. Her physical routine was unbroken by his presence. She turned on the tap, waiting for the water to run hot. She began to wash her hands with the industrial-grade antiseptic soap she had used every day of Arthur's illness. The skin on her knuckles was raw, dry, and split in tiny, painful micro-fissures. In the mirror, she saw Julian lean against the doorframe. He was watching her, his expression a mix of mild pity and the casual impatience one might show to a long-serving domestic employee who was taking too long to pack her things. "We want to make sure you're taken care of course," Julian said, his tone softening into that professional warmth he used for difficult negotiations. "We know you went through a lot with Dad at the end. It couldn't have been easy, sitting in this dark house day after day. But Chloe and I agree that a fresh start is probably exactly what you need. Somewhere smaller, easier to maintain." Eleanor rinsed her hands. The hot water stung the cracks in her skin, but she didn't flinch. She took a linen hand towel and dried each finger with deliberate, slow precision. "Arthur wanted to die here," Eleanor said softly, her back still turned to him. "And he did," Julian replied quickly, almost defensively. "Thanks to you. You did a wonderful job, Ellie, really. We're very grateful." Ellie. Arthur had been the only one who called her Eleanor. To his children, she had always been Ellie, a diminutive domestic label that stripped her of her 30 years of professional administrative experience before she had married their father. They had never asked about her life before the estate. To them, she had simply materialized when their father needed a nurse he didn't have to pay by the hour. Downstairs, a heavy glass door slid open, followed by the high-pitched, irritable voice of Chloe. "Julian, where did you put the inventory list for the study? The gallery in Chelsea needs the dimensions of the Rothko by tonight." Julian sighed, checked his Rolex, and turned toward the hallway. "I'll be right down, Chloe," he called out. He turned back to Eleanor, giving her a brief, tight-lipped nod. "We'll sit down tomorrow after breakfast and go over the logistics, Ellie. Just get some rest tonight. You look exhausted." He walked away, his footsteps fading as he descended the floating concrete staircase. Eleanor stood in the bathroom for a long time, listening to the hollow silence of the upper floor. She walked back into the bedroom and approached the nightstand. There, sitting on the dusty surface, was a small black leather notebook. It was Arthur's daily ledger. For nearly 4 years, Eleanor had kept meticulous records of every medication, every dosage, every doctor's visit, and every expense she had paid out of her own personal account when the estate's primary liquidity was frozen during Arthur's legal disputes with his former partners. She opened the notebook to the very last page. The handwriting was her own, neat and precise, ending with the time of Arthur's last breath, 4:12 a.m. Directly beneath that entry, Arthur's faint, trembling signature was scrawled, dated 3 months prior. Eleanor closed the book, her face completely expressionless. She picked it up, walked down the hall to the guest room she had occupied for the last year of Arthur's life, and placed it inside her battered leather briefcase. From downstairs, the faint sound of Julian and Chloe arguing over the value of the living room rug drifted up through the floorboards, cold and clear. The compressor of the commercial Sub-Zero refrigerator kicked on with a low, vibrating hum that Eleanor felt through the thin soles of her slippers. It was 9:42 p.m. The house had settled into its nighttime temperature, the central air conditioning blowing a dry, chilly draft through the minimalist vents in the ceiling. Eleanor stood at the kitchen island, a damp microfiber cloth in her hand. The kitchen was a vast expanse of dark quartz and brushed stainless steel, designed more like a high-end restaurant than a home. It had always been too large for her, but during the years of Arthur's illness, it had served as her command center. Here, she had measured out milligrams of crushed pills, boiled distilled water for sterile flushes, and scheduled the endless shifts of visiting nurses. Now, the counters were barren, save for 3 half-empty wine glasses and a silver tray of discarded catering hors d'oeuvres that Julian and Chloe had left behind. In the adjacent dining room, beneath the cold glow of a designer pendant lamp, the 2 siblings sat. Julian's laptop was open, casting a pale blue light across his face. Beside him, Chloe was curled in a leather chair, her fingers flicking across her tablet screen, her face illuminated by the same cold digital hue. "The inventory is short 2 items," Julian said, his voice cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't look up from his screen. He tapped a finger against his temple. "The gold Rolex Dad got for his 25th anniversary at the firm, and the leather-bound guest books from the lodge. They aren't in the study safe." Chloe didn't look up either. "Did you check the bedside drawer? Or maybe the safe in the basement?" "Already checked," Julian muttered, typing something. "I'll have to ask Howard. He probably has them in the firm's vault. He's been incredibly uncooperative today. He didn't even stay for the wake." "He's 80, Chloe said, her voice dripping with mild irritation. "He probably has a 9 o'clock bedtime. Honestly, Julian, we need to get a different firm to handle the transition. Howard's office still uses paper files. It's embarrassing." Eleanor continued to wipe the quartz island. Her movements were slow, circular, and silent. She knew exactly where the Rolex was. It was currently in a small lockbox at the local bank, deposited there 2 years ago when Arthur's medical bills had spiked and his liquid accounts were temporarily frozen due to an administrative audit. Arthur had signed the authorization himself, clear-headed enough that day to know they needed the collateral. The kids had never asked about his finances then. They had simply assumed the family wealth was an infinite, self-replenishing well. "Ellie," Chloe called out, her tone dropping into that high, sing-song pitch she used when she wanted something done without having to ask directly. Eleanor paused her hand. She did not turn around immediately. She counted to 3, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Chloe uncomfortable before she looked over her shoulder. "Yes, Chloe?" "Is there any more of that sparkling water? The imported one? My throat is so dry from all that talking today." "The sparkling water is finished," Eleanor said. Her voice was level, empty of apology. "The last case was used during the reception." Chloe frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together. "But we always have a case in the pantry. Dad literally lived on that stuff." "He did," Eleanor said, "until 3 months ago, when the carbonation began to interfere with his swallowing reflex. I stopped ordering it then." An awkward silence descended upon the room. Chloe stared at Eleanor, expecting her to offer an alternative, perhaps to drive to the 24-hour market or to prepare a hot tea instead. But Eleanor simply stood there, the damp cloth resting under her palm, waiting. Julian broke the silence, his eyes still fixed on his laptop. "It's fine, Chloe. Just drink tap. We have bigger things to worry about." He tapped his screen. "I've been looking over the property tax records for the city apartment. Ellie, do you have the keys to the penthouse on 5th? I want to drop by tomorrow afternoon to let the appraiser in." Eleanor's hand tightened slightly on the microfiber cloth. The city apartment. It had been sold 42 months ago. The transaction had been public, documented, and absolutely necessary to fund the experimental immunotherapy clinic in Munich that had given Arthur his final, lucid 18 months of life. At the time, Eleanor had sent Julian and Chloe the consent waivers, as they were listed as secondary contingent beneficiaries on the holding company that owned the unit. Neither of them had read the documents. They had simply signed the digital DocuSign links from their phones while vacationing in Ibiza, assuming it was a routine corporate refinancing. "The keys are not here," Eleanor said softly. "Where are they?" Julian asked, his voice sharpening slightly. He finally looked up from his screen, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance. "They should be in the key cabinet in the mudroom. I looked earlier and didn't see them." "The apartment is no longer available, Julian," Eleanor said. Julian stared at her, his expression blank. "What do you mean, not available? Did you rent it out without consulting us?" Before Eleanor could answer, Chloe chimed in, her voice rising. "Wait, you rented the penthouse? Ellie, that's family property. My friends were planning on staying there next month for Fashion Week. You can't just—" "I did not rent it," Eleanor said, her voice remaining entirely calm, a stark contrast to the rising tension in the dining room. She turned back to the counter, continuing her slow, circular wiping motion. "We will discuss the logistics tomorrow, as Julian suggested." "No, let's discuss it now," Julian said, closing his laptop with a sharp plastic snap. He stood up, his tall frame throwing a long shadow across the polished concrete floor as he walked into the kitchen. "The penthouse is a major asset. If there's an active tenant, we need to know the lease terms immediately. It affects the valuation for the probate filing." He stopped at the edge of the kitchen island, placing his hands on the quartz, leaning in slightly. He was trying to use his height to establish authority, a tactic Eleanor had seen him use on his younger sister 1,000 times. Eleanor stopped wiping. She looked at his hands, smooth, soft, without a single scar or callus. Then she looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were dark, tired, but completely steady. "The apartment was sold in November of 3 years ago," Eleanor said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it filled the quiet kitchen. "The proceeds were used to pay the Munich medical bills." Julian's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He blinked. "Sold? That's impossible. Dad would have told me." "You were in Monaco that November, Julian," Eleanor said, her tone devoid of accusation, stating it merely as a historical fact. "Your phone was off for 2 weeks." Chloe stood up from her chair, her tablet slipping onto the cushions. "Wait, you sold the penthouse? Our penthouse? Julian, is she allowed to do that?" Julian didn't answer his sister. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Eleanor, searching her face for a bluff, a mistake, some sign of weakness. But there was nothing. Only the cold, gray exhaustion of a woman who had spent 4 years watching a man die, while his children watched from across an ocean. "We will look at the bank records tomorrow morning," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, tight with a sudden, unacknowledged panic. "Every single ledger. Howard will have the statements." "Yes," Eleanor said, folding the microfiber cloth into a neat, perfect square. "He will." She picked up the tray of discarded catering food, carried it to the trash bin, and let the lid swing shut with a quiet, final click. At 1:47 a.m., the villa was a cavern of concrete and glass, holding the cold night air like a tomb. Eleanor sat in the high-backed leather chair in Arthur's study. She did not turn on the desk lamp. The only illumination came from the silver wash of the moon, spilling through the double-height windows, casting long, barred shadows of the window frames across the oak floor. In her hand, she held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with tap water. She didn't drink. She simply watched the tiny bubbles cling to the inside of the glass, rising slowly to the surface before popping in silence. The house was never truly silent, of course. Without the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of Arthur's oxygen machine, other sounds took its place. The rhythmic clack-tick of the copper pipes expanding in the walls, the distant muffled drone of the pool filtration system in the backyard, and, from the open mezzanine above the foyer, the hushed, frantic murmur of voices. "She's lying," Chloe's voice hissed, the sound traveling down the concrete stairwell, thin and sharp. "Julian, she has to be. Dad wouldn't just liquidate the penthouse without telling us. He knew I wanted that place. He promised me the keys when I turned 30. He was on heavy narcotics for the last 6 months, Chloe," Julian's voice replied, lower, tighter, laced with a controlled panic. "If she had him sign a power of attorney while he wasn't of sound mind, we can contest it. It's elder abuse. We can void the sale." "Can we? It's been 3 years. The money is gone. She said she spent it on Munich." A brief pause, the sound of a glass being set down hard on a stone table. "Who spends $4 million on a clinic? It's absurd. She probably funneled it into a private account." "I'm texting Howard's junior partner now," Julian said. The faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a phone keyboard echoed down. "He's not answering. Of course he's not answering. It's 2 a.m. But I've left a paper trail. First thing tomorrow, we freeze everything. Every single account. We cut off the house cards." Eleanor sat perfectly still in the dark. Her thumb remained resting on the rim of her glass. She did not feel anger. She felt only the cold, logical calculation of a mathematical equation. Julian's threat to cut off the house cards was particularly amusing. He didn't know that the primary credit card he used for his travel expenses, the black Amex under the corporate umbrella of Arthur's holding company, had been funded for the last 8 months entirely by Eleanor's personal consulting fee, which she had quietly diverted to keep the estate from triggering a default notice. She had allowed him to keep spending. She had allowed Chloe to charge her designer handbags and first-class flights to the family account. Every statement was filed away in the locked steel cabinet beneath the desk where Eleanor sat. Each receipt was a ledger of their complete detachment. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the study. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't turn her head. The study door, heavy oak with a bronze latch, swung open. The wedge of pale yellow light from the hallway spilled across the floor, stopping just inches from Eleanor's slippers. Chloe stood in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe that dragged slightly on the dusty floor. She was holding her phone, its screen glowing. She stopped short when she saw the silhouette in the chair. "Jesus, Ellie," Chloe gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "You scared the life out of me. Why are you sitting in the dark?" "I was listening," Eleanor said. Her voice did not shake. It was a low, steady hum in the shadows. "Listening to what?" Chloe asked, her eyes darting around the room, as if expecting to find someone else there. She took a step inside. Her perfume, something expensive, heavy with jasmine and amber, cutting through the lingering smell of Arthur's old papers. "There's nothing to listen to. The house is empty." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "It is very quiet now." Chloe crossed her arms, leaning her hip against the edge of the mahogany desk. She looked down at Eleanor, her expression shifting from startled to cold, her eyes scanning the older woman's face for any sign of guilt or fear. "Julian is furious," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that was entirely insincere. "About the penthouse. He thinks you've been less than transparent with us, Ellie. We're his children. We have a right to know where our father's assets went." "Your father's assets went to keeping him alive," Eleanor said. "For 3 years, the clinical trials in Munich allowed him to know your names when you called, on the rare occasions that you did." Chloe's jaw tightened. "Don't do that. Don't play the martyr. You were paid to be here, Ellie. Dad took care of you. He gave you a roof over your head, this house, a lifestyle you could never have dreamed of on your own. You were his wife, yes, but let's be real. It was an arrangement. You got security, and he got a live-in nurse who didn't complain." Eleanor looked up at her stepdaughter. In the pale moonlight, Chloe's face looked sharp, almost skeletal, her youth masked by a hard, transactional bitterness. "An arrangement," Eleanor repeated the word softly, testing its weight. "Yes," Chloe said, straightening up. "And now that the arrangement is over, things have to change. Julian is already drafting the transition paperwork. We think it's best if we start the probate process with a clean slate. You should probably start looking for a place in the city. We'll give you a reasonable window, of course, 30 days. But after that, Julian wants the keys." Eleanor did not answer. She let the silence stretch between them like a physical barrier. Chloe waited, expecting tears or perhaps a defensive outburst. When neither came, she let out a sharp, frustrated breath through her nose. "Fine, sit in the dark if you want, but don't say we didn't warn you. Tomorrow morning, we're taking control of the estate." Chloe turned on her heel and swept out of the room, leaving the door wide open. Eleanor remained in the chair. She raised the glass to her lips and took a single, slow sip of the cold tap water. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and unlocked it. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the deep, dark circles under her eyes. She opened her email. There was a draft she had saved 3 weeks ago, addressed to Howard's private, unlisted email account. Attached to it were the certified copies of the irrevocable trust agreement Arthur had signed before his memory began to fray. A trust that held not only the title to the villa they were sitting in, but the deed to the vacation homes in Tuscany and Aspen and the remaining cash reserves of the family corporation. She looked at the draft. Then, with a slow, deliberate tap of her thumb, she deleted the draft. She would not send it yet. Let them call the lawyers. Let them try to freeze the accounts. Let them print the eviction papers they were currently drafting upstairs. The longer they spent climbing the hill of their own arrogance, the further they would have to fall. The sky through the double-height glass walls of the villa was a bruised, watery blue, typical of a wet dawn in early autumn. The heated concrete floors beneath Eleanor's bare feet were lukewarm, the automatic system having clicked on at 5:30 a.m. according to the schedule she had programmed into the wall panel 3 years ago. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, watching the electric kettle slowly come to a boil. The tiny blue LED light on the base of the kettle cast a cold glow across the polished stone countertop. Beside it sat a single white ceramic mug, a tea bag of cheap orange Pico, and a small paring knife. She did not make a pot. She made only enough for herself. For 48 months, her mornings had begun with a complex, exhausting chemistry. 3 different blood pressure medications crushed into applesauce, a liquid potassium supplement that smelled of artificial cherry, and a warm cup of bone broth. Now there was only the quiet hiss of the boiling water. A door clicked open down the hall. Julian walked into the kitchen. He was already dressed in a crisp, light blue button-down shirt and dark trousers, though he hadn't yet put on his belt or shoes. His hair was damp from the shower, and his eyes were bloodshot, the dark shadows beneath them proof of a sleepless night spent cataloging assets. He didn't look at Eleanor. He walked straight to the cabinet, pulled out a clean mug, and stood by the espresso machine. He pressed the button. The machine whined, a high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed off the concrete walls, followed by the deep, throaty rumble of the grinder. "Did you get some sleep?" Julian asked over the noise of the machine. It wasn't a question born of concern. It was the polite, empty filler used by a manager before a performance review. "A few hours," Eleanor replied, pouring the boiling water into her mug. "Good, good." Julian took his espresso, blew on the steam, and turned to face her. He leaned his hip against the island, his free hand slipping into his pocket. He looked polished, but there was a subtle, nervous energy in the way his fingers tapped against his thigh. He reached onto the counter behind him and picked up a thick, white manila folder that he must have brought down with him. He slid it across the quartz. The paper made a soft, scraping sound. "Chloe and I were up late," Julian said, his voice dropping into his corporate cadence. "We were talking about the logistics of the estate transition. As I mentioned yesterday, we really want to make sure this is as clean and painless as possible for everyone involved." Eleanor looked down at the folder. In neat, printed letters on the tab, his assistant had typed, "Estate of Arthur Vance, Residential Transition." "What is this, Julian?" she asked, her voice quiet. "It's a formal notice of occupancy termination," Julian said. He took a sip of his espresso, his eyes tracking her reaction. When she didn't flinch, he cleared his throat and continued. "Technically, under the terms of the holding company that owns this property, your right of residency was tied to Dad's life estate. Now that he's passed, the holding company is legally obligated to prepare the property for liquidation." He reached out, flipped the folder open, and pointed to a document inside. It was a formal 3-page legal notice, complete with a state court header. "We're giving you 30 days, Julian said, his tone incredibly reasonable, almost gentle, which is actually more than the statutory minimum. We've waived the standard utility fees for the duration of your stay, and we're willing to contribute $5,000 toward your moving expenses, provided the house is left in broom-clean condition by the 1st of next month." Eleanor looked at the document. Her eyes lingered on the signature line at the bottom. Julian Vance, co-executor. Chloe Vance, co-executor. They had signed it in blue ink. The ink was fresh, slightly raised on the heavy bond paper. "This was drafted quickly," Eleanor observed. "My firm keeps standard real estate templates on file," Julian said, shrugged his shoulders slightly. "It's just administrative, Ellie. We have to file the probate papers by Friday, and the court requires proof of notification for all current occupants of estate-owned properties. If we don't file this, the entire probate timeline gets pushed back, and we're looking at thousands of dollars in carrying costs." He was using his polite, logical voice. He was explaining it as if he were a neutral third party, a helpful guide navigating a complex system, rather than the person who had initiated the eviction. It was the classic weaponized incompetence of the wealthy, hiding behind the system to excuse a profound act of cruelty. "And if I need more than 30 days?" Eleanor asked. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, as we noted in Section 4, any holdover tenancy past the 30-day mark will incur a daily liquidated damages fee of $500. It's just to protect us from the buyer's brokers. They want the house staged and empty by the second week of next month." "You already have a broker?" "We've been in talks with Sotheby's for a few weeks," Julian said, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Dad's illness was terminal, Ellie. We had to plan ahead. It would have been irresponsible not to." Eleanor looked at her tea. The water had turned a dark, muddy amber. The tea bag sat at the bottom of the mug, its string hanging limply over the rim. She thought about the last 6 months. She thought about the nights she had spent sleeping on a cot in Arthur's room because his breathing was too shallow for her to leave him alone. She thought about the way Julian had called her from a yacht in Greece, his voice slurred with wine, asking if his father could hurry up and sign the deed transfer for the Aspen cabin before the tax laws changed in July. She had not told Arthur about that call. She had protected him from his own children's eagerness for his death until the very end. "I see," Eleanor said. She reached out and took the folder. She didn't tear it. She didn't throw it. She simply closed it, tapping the edges against the quartz counter to align the papers perfectly, and placed it next to her tea. Julian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. He smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "Thanks, Ellie. I knew you'd understand. We really do appreciate how cooperative you're being. I'll have my assistant send over the digital copies for your records." "No need," Eleanor said. "The paper copy is sufficient." She picked up her tea mug and the folder. Without another word, she walked out of the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the lukewarm concrete, leaving Julian alone with the hum of his espresso machine. By 9:15 a.m., the damp blue of dawn had burned away into a glaring, flat white sky. Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom. She was performing a task she had done every Tuesday morning for 4 years, updating the estate's physical ledger. But today she was not entering the medical expenses or the oxygen tank deliveries. She was cataloging her own possessions. Her hands moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. She wrapped her mother's silver-plated vanity mirror in a soft flannel cloth. She placed 3 leather-bound journals, her personal diaries from the years before she met Arthur, into the bottom of her leather briefcase. Every movement was silent. She did not slam drawers. She did not rush. Outside her door, the house was beginning to experience its first microscopic friction. "Julian!" Chloe's voice echoed down the hall, sharp and laced with the immediate childish panic of someone whose morning routine has been slightly inconvenienced. "Is your phone working? My tablet won't connect to the high-speed line. It keeps throwing a DNS error." "It's fine for me," Julian called back from the study. A pause. "Wait, no, the signal is there, but nothing is loading. It's just spinning." Eleanor did not look up from her packing. Underneath the desk, plugged into a dedicated outlet, was the central smart home bridge. The estate's entire infrastructure, from the high-speed fiber optic router to the automated climate control and the security cameras, was routed through a commercial-grade network. Arthur had insisted on it for his privacy. Because he couldn't manage the technology, Eleanor had set up the account under her personal consulting LLC, using her own email and her own credit card for the monthly billing. 10 minutes ago, while the kettle was cooling, Eleanor had opened the Network Administrator app on her phone. With 3 taps, she had downgraded the guest network's bandwidth to 128 kilobytes per second, the speed of a dial-up connection from 1998. She had also revoked the automated login privileges for Julian's and Chloe's devices. "Ellie!" Julian's heavy footsteps approached her door. He didn't knock. He simply pushed it open, holding his phone out like a broken compass. "Is the internet down?" he asked, his tone impatient. "I'm in the middle of a wire transfer and the connection just dropped. Do we need to reset the router?" Eleanor placed a small silver pen into her briefcase and clicked the latch shut. She looked at Julian calmly. "The system is managed by a third-party security firm, Julian. They run automatic diagnostic updates on Tuesdays." "Well, how long does it take?" Julian muttered, looking at his screen. "I have a call with the appraisers in 20 minutes. Can you call them and tell them to bypass the update?" "I don't have the administrator portal open right now," Eleanor said. "And the account is registered under a corporate security block. They don't take verbal bypass requests." Julian let out a sharp, irritated breath. "This is ridiculous. Dad paid $20,000 for this system. It should work." He looked around her room, his eyes lingering on the packed briefcase, then back to her. "Just see if you can get them on the phone when you have a minute, okay?" He turned and stroked back down the hallway, already barking commands at Chloe to use her phone's hotspot. Eleanor sat in the silence he left behind. She calculated the energy it would have taken to explain that the corporate security block was her own LLC, and that she had paid the security firm's invoice out of her personal pocket last month because the estate's executor account was locked in probate. She chose the silence. A sharp, rhythmic buzzing sound began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was the front gate intercom. Usually, the morning delivery from the organic cooperative arrived at 9:30 a.m. For years, Eleanor would answer the intercom, buzz the driver through the security gates, meet him at the side entrance, and spend 45 minutes sanitizing the glass milk bottles, organizing the fresh produce, and preparing Arthur's soft diet purees. The buzzer rang again, a long, demanding tone. In the hallway, Chloe's bedroom door opened. "Julian, are you going to get that? It's making a horrible noise." "I'm on a call with Zurich, Chloe," Julian shouted back from the study. "Get it yourself." "I'm in the middle of a dry brushing routine," Chloe protested. The intercom buzzer rang a third time. Eleanor sat at her desk. She picked up a lukewarm mug of tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. Through her window, she could see the delivery van parked outside the massive black iron gates of the estate, its hazard lights blinking lazily in the bright morning sun. The driver waited for another 2 minutes. Then, as Eleanor watched, he climbed back into the cab, drove the van forward a few feet, and began unloading the heavy wooden crates of organic groceries directly onto the gravel driveway, right outside the security gate. He left 3 cartons of raw, unpasteurized milk, 2 crates of fresh heirloom vegetables, and a specialized cooler containing wild-caught salmon and artisanal cheeses sitting in the gravel. The morning sun was climbing higher, the heat starting to radiate off the asphalt. Eleanor knew exactly what would happen. Within an hour, the milk would begin to sour in the heat. The ice packs in the cooler would melt, and the raw fish would begin to spoil under the direct rays of the sun. The total cost of the delivery was $342, billed directly to the house account. She did not get up. She did not buzz the gate. She simply watched a single black crow land on the top of the iron gate, staring down at the wooden crates with keen, hungry eyes. By 11:15 a.m., the brutalist concrete walls of the villa had begun to absorb the direct glare of the midday sun. The massive, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that made the architecture so striking in design magazines were now acting as a giant greenhouse. Inside, the air was growing thick and warm. Eleanor stood in the main foyer, quietly removing her personal art books from the lower shelves of the floating walnut bookcase. She stacked them into neat, heavy towers on the floor. Her hands were calm, her movements measured. In her pocket, her phone vibrated once. It was a notification from the Smart Home app. The system had successfully transitioned the estate's dual compressor HVAC system into seasonal conservation mode, a setting Eleanor had configured months ago to save on electricity when the house was empty. It capped the cooling at 78 degrees and locked the physical wall panels. To override it, one needed the master administrative password. A heavy glass door slid open at the back of the house, followed by the sound of Chloe's heels clicking frantically across the terrazzo. "Julian! Julian! Come down here right now!" Julian's study door opened upstairs, and he descended the floating stairs, his collar unbuttoned further, a damp sheen of sweat already visible on his forehead. "What? What is it, Chloe? I'm trying to draft the inventory email to Sotheby's." "Go look at the front gate," Chloe said, her face flushed, her voice trembling with disgust. She was holding her nose with 2 fingers. "The grocery delivery. It's just sitting out there in the gravel. The driver didn't bring it in." Julian frowned, walking toward the massive glass front door. He peered out through the tinted glass toward the security gates. "Why the hell did he leave it out there?" "Because nobody buzzed him in," Chloe snapped, her voice rising. "The raw salmon is warm, Julian. It smells like hot garbage already. And the milk cartons are literally swelling in the heat. It's disgusting. Hundreds of dollars of food, completely ruined." Julian turned, his eyes instantly scanning the foyer, until they landed on Eleanor, who was dusting the spine of a leather-bound poetry book. "Ellie," Julian said, his corporate composure slipping into a harder, more aggressive tone. "Did you hear the gate buzzer?" Eleanor did not look up from her book. She wiped a speck of dust from the cover with her thumb. "I did." "Then why didn't you let him in?" Julian asked, taking 2 long steps toward her. "You knew the delivery was coming. You always manage the grocery schedule." "I did manage it," Eleanor said, her voice quiet and perfectly level. "But as of 9 o'clock this morning, when you served me with the notice of occupancy termination, my responsibilities to the estate's daily operations ceased. I am now a tenant in transition. My priority is packing my belongings." Julian stared at her, his jaw tightening. "Are you serious? It's a gate buzzer, Ellie. It takes 2 seconds to press a button. This is just petty." "It is a matter of administrative clarity," Eleanor replied. She placed the book onto the stack on the floor. "The delivery was billed to the house account, which you and Chloe are currently auditing. I didn't want to interfere with your oversight of the estate's cash flow." Chloe let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Are you kidding me? You're letting hundreds of dollars of food rot in the sun to make a point? Julian, tell her she has to clean it up. It's right outside our gate." "I am not authorized to manage the waste disposal services anymore, Chloe," Eleanor said, finally looking up. Her gaze was direct, cool, and entirely unbothered. "The contract is registered under the estate. If you want the spoiled food removed from the driveway, you will need to contact the sanitation department directly. The number is on the corkboard in the pantry." Julian wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Why is it so hot in here? Is the AC broken? It feels like an oven." He marched over to the sleek, circular, smart thermostat mounted on the concrete pillar near the kitchen. He tapped the glass screen. It lit up, displaying a bright amber lock icon and the words, "System locked, Eco mode active, administrative override required." "Ellie," Julian said, his voice tight, "what is the passcode for the thermostat?" "I don't have the administrative override code on hand, Julian," Eleanor said, continuing her packing. "As I told you earlier, the climate control is linked to the same security profile as the high-speed network. They run their updates together." "This is ridiculous," Julian muttered, tapping the screen harder, as if physical force would make the concrete structure cool down. "It's 80 degrees in here. We have appraisers coming tomorrow. We can't have them walking into a greenhouse that smells like rotting fish." "Then I suggest you contact the security firm," Eleanor said. "Though, as I recall, their customer service line has an automated queue on Tuesdays. It usually takes several hours to reach a human representative." Julian turned back to her, his face reddening. He looked at the stacks of books at her feet, then at her calm, unhurried posture. For the first time, a small flicker of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. He was used to people reacting to his anger, employees scrambling to fix mistakes, Chloe whining until she got her way. But Eleanor's complete lack of friction was disorienting. It was like shouting into a heavy velvet curtain. The sound was simply absorbed, leaving nothing but silence. "We're going to Howard's office," Julian said to Chloe, his tone sharp as he tried to reassert his dominance over the situation. "We'll get the probate files. We'll get the login credentials for all these smart home accounts, and we'll sort this out ourselves. Come on." "What about the fish?" Chloe whined, looking out the window with a look of pure dread. "Julian, the smell is going to get into the house if we leave it there." "Then put on some gloves and move it to the bins yourself," Julian snapped, turning toward the stairs to grab his shoes. "Me? In the dirt? Are you insane?" Chloe cried, following him up the stairs, her complaints fading into the upper levels of the warm, suffocating villa. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet foyer. She walked to the large glass front door and looked out. A fly had already found the melting cooler of salmon. She felt no urge to clean it. She felt no urge to help them. She simply picked up her stack of books, her arms steady under the weight, and carried them back to her room. By 1:45 p.m., the internal temperature of the villa's main gallery had climbed to 82 degrees. The stagnant air felt heavy, holding the warmth of the concrete floors like a slow oven. Eleanor stood at the quartz kitchen island, slicing a cold cucumber. The crisp, rhythmic crunch of the knife through the watery green skin was the only sound in the kitchen. She breathed in the cool, clean scent of the cucumber, a sharp, refreshing contrast to the thick, humid atmosphere of the rest of the house. She was preparing a simple lunch: 2 slices of dry rye bread, the sliced cucumber, and a glass of tepid water. Since the ice maker's automated water line filter had expired 3 days ago, the refrigerator had stopped dispensing ice. Usually, Eleanor would have replaced the filter cartridge herself from the supply closet, but the closet was locked and the key was on her personal ring. She had decided to leave it there. In the hallway, the heavy thud of Julian's designer loafers echoed as he paced. His voice was loud, strained, and cracking with frustration as he spoke into his phone's speaker. "Look, I don't care about the policy," Julian shouted, his corporate polish completely evaporating in the heat. "I am Julian Vance, Arthur Vance's eldest son and the designated executor in his primary will. I am calling to verify the balance on the commercial operating account." A polite, tinny voice drifted from the phone's speaker. "I understand your position, Mr. Vance. However, our security protocols are very strict. To access the account details verbally, I need you to verify the verbal security PIN or answer the secondary security question. What was the name of your father's first pet?" Julian stopped pacing. He stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen, his face flushed red, his shirt sticking to his chest in dark patches of sweat. He stared blankly at the floor. "His first pet?" Julian muttered, his voice dropping into an angry, embarrassed register. "How the hell am I supposed to know that? He was born in 1948. Just look at the death certificate I emailed your branch manager this morning." "I apologize, sir." The representative's voice was unyielding. "Until the probate court formally ratifies your executor status and we receive the certified court seals, we cannot bypass the security questions. Is there anyone else on the account who might know the PIN? The secondary name on the file is an Eleanor Vance." Julian's eyes snapped up, locking onto Eleanor. Eleanor placed a slice of cucumber onto her rye bread. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not look at him. She did not offer a word. "Is she on the phone?" the representative asked. "No," Julian snapped, his thumb slamming down on the red end call button. He shoved the phone into his pocket, his breathing heavy. He wiped his brow with his sleeve, glaring at Eleanor's back. "You know the PIN, don't you?" Eleanor turned around slowly, holding her plate. "The security questions were set up by your father when he was still able to manage his affairs, Julian. He chose answers that were personal to him." "Just tell me the PIN, Ellie," Julian said, taking a step toward her. He was trying to sound commanding, but the sweat running down his temple made him look weak. "We need to clear the pending invoices for the funeral home and the caterers. If those bounce, it's going to be a legal nightmare." "I am no longer authorized to manage the estate's financial transactions," Eleanor said, her voice cool and light. "As of this morning, you are the sole authority. I wouldn't want to overstep my bounds as a temporary occupant." "This isn't a game," Julian hissed. "This is our family's money." "Then you should have no trouble accessing it," Eleanor said. She walked past him, carrying her simple plate toward the small dining nook. She didn't look back to see his reaction. Chloe descended the stairs, her linen sundress wrinkling in the heat. She was carrying her leather handbag, using a folded fashion magazine to desperately fan her face. "Julian, please tell me we're leaving. The car has been running with the AC on for 10 minutes, but the leather seats are still boiling. If I stay in this house another second, I'm going to pass out." Julian glared at Eleanor one last time before turning to his sister. "Yes, we're leaving. We're going straight to Howard's office. I'm going to get the physical files, the passwords, and the court filings. If he won't give them to me, I'll call the managing partner of his firm." "Good," Chloe said, casting a disdainful look at Eleanor's simple lunch. "And while we're there, we should ask Howard to speed up the eviction. This place is unlivable anyway." "Don't touch anything in the study while we're gone, Ellie," Julian said, his voice tight with a final hollow attempt at authority. "I've locked the desk drawers." "I have no reason to enter your father's study," Eleanor said. She watched them walk toward the front door. Julian's shirt was damp, his shoulders tense. Chloe's face was twisted in a permanent grimace of discomfort. They opened the heavy glass door, and a blast of hot, stagnant air from the driveway swept into the foyer, carrying with it the faint, sickly sweet scent of the rotting salmon sitting outside the gate. The door shut behind them with a heavy, pressurized thud. The automatic deadbolt clicked into place, locking them out of the house. Eleanor sat in the warm, quiet dining nook. She ate her sandwich slowly, savoring the crispness of the cucumber. Once she finished, she washed her plate, dried it, and put it away. She walked down the hallway toward the study. Julian had indeed locked the desk drawers. She looked at the brass lock on the mahogany desk, a simple, standard cabinet lock. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, flat brass key. It was the master key Arthur had given her when they built the desk. She inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, oiled click. She slid the deep drawer open. Inside sat a thick, dark blue leather portfolio labeled "The Vance Irrevocable Trust." Eleanor opened it. Her eyes scanned the clean, elegant lines of the trust document, drafted by Howard 4 years ago, long before Arthur's mind had begun to fail. She flipped to the schedule of assets. Listed under the trust's absolute ownership was the villa they were currently standing in. the vacation homes in Aspen and Tuscany, the primary commercial holding accounts, and most importantly, the primary mortgage on the villa itself, a mortgage that Arthur's corporation had taken out years ago, which was now held entirely by the trust. The estate that Julian and Chloe were currently rushing to probate was a hollowed-out shell. It contained nothing but Arthur's personal debts, his remaining medical liabilities, and a massive, unpaid mortgage that the trust had the legal right to foreclose on at any moment. Julian and Chloe were the sole heirs to the estate, but Eleanor was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary of the trust. She closed the portfolio, slid the drawer shut, and locked it again. She stood up, walked back to the kitchen, and poured herself another glass of tepid water, waiting for the afternoon sun to do its work. By 4:45 p.m., the sun had shifted to the west, casting long, dusty shafts of amber light through the high, unshaded windows of the sunroom. The concrete walls had fully baked under the afternoon sun, radiating a dry, heavy heat that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. Eleanor stood in the sunroom, a pair of small brass shears in her hand. She was pruning the delicate star-shaped leaves of Arthur's favorite Japanese maple bonsai. The soft, rhythmic snip, snip of the shears was incredibly quiet, followed by the dry rustle of the tiny discarded leaves falling onto the glass table below. She worked with slow, surgical precision, cutting away only the dead, yellowing edges to preserve the healthy green underneath. It was a chore she had performed twice a week for 4 years. Arthur had loved this little tree. He used to sit in his wheelchair for hours watching her prune it, his eyes tracking her hands when his voice was already gone. Outside, the heavy metallic crunch of gravel signaled the return of the black SUV. 2 doors slammed shut, sharp, echoing cracks in the quiet afternoon. A moment later, the front door deadbolt clicked back, and the heavy glass door swung open. Julian and Chloe walked into the foyer, and the physical toll of their afternoon was immediately visible. Julian had discarded his sports jacket entirely. His light blue shirt was heavily wrinkled, clinging to his back and chest in dark patches of sweat. His hair, usually styled back with product, was flat and messy. Chloe walked behind him, her face flushed a dark, angry pink, her leather sandals slapping irritably against the terrazzo. "It's hotter in here than it is outside," Chloe groaned, dropping her designer handbag onto the concrete floor with a heavy thud. She marched straight to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator door, and stood in front of it, hoping for a draft of cold air. "Julian, this is insane. We need to check into a hotel. I can't sleep in this oven." Julian didn't answer her. He stood in the arched entryway of the sunroom, his eyes locking onto Eleanor. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling quickly. "Howard wasn't there," Julian said. His voice was no longer corporate and smooth. It was tight, thin, and vibrating with a controlled, furious panic. Eleanor didn't stop her work. She snipped a small dried branch from the lower trunk of the bonsai. "He is an old man, Julian. He often takes his afternoons away from the office." "His junior partner, Davies, was there," Julian said, taking a step closer. The heat radiating off him was palpable. "He said Howard was unavailable for the remainder of the week, and when I demanded the physical files for the estate's primary accounts, do you know what he told me?" Eleanor placed the brass shears on the glass table. She picked up a small, fine mist water bottle and began to spray the moss at the base of the tree. The soft pft, pft of the water was the only sound. "I imagine he told you that he couldn't release them." "He said the accounts are restricted," Julian hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. "He said all files regarding Vance Holdings and the primary estate assets have been transferred to an off-site trustee. He wouldn't even give me the account numbers. He said he was legally barred from discussing them with anyone other than the designated trustee." "Who is the trustee, Ellie?" Eleanor didn't look at him. She misted the delicate green leaves, watching the tiny droplets of water cling to the surface before rolling down the stems. "Your father had many advisors, Julian." "Don't play dumb with me," Julian shouted, his voice cracking, echoing off the high concrete ceiling. "You've been whispering in his ear for 4 years while he was half dead. Did you convince him to put some third-party bank in charge? Is that what this is? Some corporate trustee trying to freeze us out so they can collect management fees?" Eleanor turned her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting his. Her expression was a mask of absolute, chilling serenity. "Your father was a very intelligent man, Julian. Even when his body failed him, his mind was always focused on preservation. He knew exactly what would happen to his life's work once he was gone." "This is a mistake," Julian said, though his voice shook. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I've already left 3 messages for our family's corporate counsel in New York. They're going to file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning. If Howard is withholding estate files from the legal executors, we'll have a court order on his desk by noon." Before Eleanor could reply, Chloe walked out of the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. Her face had gone completely pale, her earlier irritation replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. "Julian," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Julian, hang up." Julian turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What? I'm trying to—" "The hotel just called me," Chloe said, her eyes wide, staring at her brother as if she had just seen a ghost. "The concierge at the Four Seasons. They said the corporate card we used to book our rooms was declined during the afternoon authorization check. They said the bank flagged the account for unauthorized overdraft and locked the card." Julian blinked, his mouth opening slightly. "That's impossible." "That card is linked to the primary operating account of Vance Holdings. There's a $250,000 monthly limit on that account." "Well, it's declined," Chloe cried, her voice rising in pitch. "And they said if we don't provide a personal credit card with a $50,000 authorization hold by 6 o'clock, they're going to cancel our reservations and charge us the cancellation fee. Julian, my personal cards are almost maxed out from the flights from Milan. I don't have that kind of limit." Julian's face went white. He stared at his sister. Then slowly, his gaze drifted back to Eleanor. Eleanor picked up her brass shears again. She looked at a tiny, stubborn brown leaf near the crown of the bonsai. She had known the credit card would be declined. She had known it because at 2 p.m. she had authorized the trust's accounting firm to transition Vance Holdings into a non-operating holding entity, effectively freezing all outstanding corporate credit lines associated with the estate. She did not say a word. She did not explain. She simply let the silence of the sweltering house settle over them, thick and suffocating as the first cold realization of their true position began to sink in. By 6:15 p.m., the sun had slipped below the western tree line, leaving the sky a bruised, dusty violet. The concrete walls of the villa remained warm to the touch, slowly radiating the stored heat of the day back into the darkened rooms. Eleanor stood in the sunroom, sweeping up the dried leaves she had pruned from the Japanese maple. The rhythmic shh, shh of the straw bristles against the textured concrete floor was the only sound in the central gallery. She moved with quiet deliberation, gathering the tiny star-shaped brown leaves into a neat, fragile pile. In the kitchen, the shadows had stretched, long and dark, swallowing the high-end appliances. Julian sat at the quartz island, his laptop open but dark. His phone was pressed to his ear. The speaker was turned down, but Eleanor could hear the faint, urgent murmur of a bank representative on the other end. "Yes, I understand the guarantor clause," Julian whispered, his hand gripping the edge of the island so hard his knuckles turned a bloodless white. "But the corporate guarantor is Vance Holdings. I am the designated executor of the estate that owns the holdings. Why would the personal line be suspended prior to the formal probate hearing?" He paused, listening. A bead of sweat rolled slowly down his temple, tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "An automated suspension?" Julian's voice cracked slightly. He closed his eyes. "No, do not escalate it to the regional compliance team. Just leave it. I'll call back tomorrow." He pulled the phone away and stared at the dark screen. The corporate guarantor for Julian's personal multi-million-dollar line of credit in New York was indeed Vance Holdings. But the guarantor agreement contained a standard, non-negotiable clause. Upon the death of the primary shareholder, all associated credit facilities were automatically suspended pending a solvency audit by the trustee. Julian had signed that agreement 5 years ago when his hedge fund needed a capital injection. He had never read the fine print. To him, his father's name on a document was a magic wand that never lost its power. Chloe was sitting on the bottom step of the floating concrete staircase, her knees pulled to her chest. Her linen dress was rumpled, and she looked smaller, stripped of the polished, untouchable aura she usually wore. "Julian," she said, her voice hollow. "The Four Seasons canceled the rooms. They said the cancellation fee has already been charged to the card, but since the account is locked, they're going to send the invoice to our registered home address. We can't go there." Julian didn't look at her. "We'll stay here tonight." "Here?" Chloe looked up at the high, dark ceiling. "Julian, it's 84 degrees in this house. The water from the tap tastes like iron, and it's warm. The fridge is starting to smell because the power load shedding kicked in. We can't sleep here." "We don't have a choice, Chloe," Julian snapped, his voice sharp with the pressure of a man who was suddenly realizing the floor beneath him was made of thin glass. "My personal cards are flagged because of the guarantor freeze. I have $3,000 in my checking account. That's it. Until I get Howard to release the primary operating accounts tomorrow, we are illiquid." Chloe stared at him, her mouth slightly open. 3,000? Julian, you made $500,000 last year." "I have overhead, Chloe," he yelled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "My apartment in Manhattan is $8,000 a month. My car lease is $2,000. I have margin calls on my tech portfolio. I don't just have cash sitting around." Eleanor continued to sweep. She pushed the pile of leaves into a black plastic dustpan. The soft tap of the plastic against the floor was loud in the sudden silence that followed Julian's outburst. Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the terrazzo. He walked into the foyer, stopping a few feet from where Eleanor stood. He looked at the dustpan, then up at her face. "Where is the key to the study safe, Ellie?" he asked. He was trying to sound calm, but his chest was heaving. "The wall safe behind the painting. Dad always kept emergency cash in there. I remember him telling me he kept 50,000 in physical currency for security." Eleanor emptied the leaves into a small paper bag. "Your father changed the lock on the wall safe 18 months ago, Julian. When his memory began to fail, he couldn't remember the digital combination, so he had a locksmith install a dual-key mechanical cylinder." "Where are the keys?" "He kept them on his personal key ring," Eleanor said. "The brass ring with the leather fob." Julian's brow furrowed. "I checked his personal effects. The hospital gave us his watch, his wedding ring, and his wallet. There were no keys." "The hospital did not have his keys," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and untroubled. "He lost them 3 weeks before he was admitted. He believed he dropped them in the garden." "In the garden?" Julian stared at her, his eyes wide. "This estate is 4 acres of landscaped forest. How are we supposed to find a set of brass keys in 4 acres of dirt?" "I don't know," Eleanor said. In truth, the keys were currently sitting in the bottom of the velvet-lined jewelry box in Eleanor's bedroom, right next to her mother's silver mirror. She had found them in the sunroom cushions the day Arthur was taken to the hospital. She had kept them because she knew that if Julian found them, he would immediately empty the safe to pay his credit card bills, ignoring the fact that the cash inside belonged to the trust, not the estate. And even if they drilled the safe open, which would cost several $1,000s they didn't have, they would find nothing inside but Arthur's old diaries, a few faded photographs of his first wife, and a copy of the very trust agreement they were trying so desperately to ignore. "We'll look for them tomorrow," Julian muttered, rubbing his eyes. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumping. "Chloe, go up and find some clean sheets. We'll just have to open the windows and deal with the heat tonight." "The windows don't open, Julian," Chloe said, her voice dull. "They're sealed glass panels for the climate control system. The only ventilation is the front and back doors." Julian didn't answer. He walked back to the kitchen island, slumped into the bar stool, and stared at the dark screen of his laptop, his face illuminated only by the faint purplish light of the fading dusk. Eleanor walked to the front door. She checked the deadbolt, ensuring it was locked. Then she picked up her paper bag of dried leaves, carried it to her room, and closed her door, leaving the siblings to spend their first night in the dark, sweltering house they claimed to own. By 11:45 p.m., the air inside the villa was completely stagnant. Julian and Chloe had opened the heavy sliding glass doors at the front and back of the house to create a cross breeze, but the night was dead without even a whisper of wind. Instead, the humid, heavy night air had crept inside, bringing with it the high-pitched, maddening whine of gnats and mosquitoes. Along with the insects came the unmistakable, sickly sweet stench of the rotting salmon from the gravel driveway, drifting through the open doors and settling into the fabrics of the expensive, minimalist furniture. In her dark bedroom, Eleanor lay on top of her sheets. She wore a simple, sleeveless white cotton nightgown. Despite the heat, she was calm, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Over the years of Arthur's illness, she had learned how to manage her physical responses to discomfort. She had spent countless sweltering summer nights sitting by his bedside when his neurological fever spiked, holding cold compresses to his forehead, her own body slick with sweat, never once complaining. She knew how to find a quiet, cool place inside her own mind. A sharp metallic clink from the kitchen broke the silence. Eleanor sat up. She slipped her feet into her slippers and walked down the dark hallway. Her movements were entirely silent, a ghost navigating the warm, concrete corridors. She reached the kitchen. The moonlight illuminated Julian. He was leaning against the quartz island, dressed only in his boxers and a gray, sweat-soaked t-shirt. He had a flashlight in one hand, its beam cutting a harsh, dusty line through the darkness, and a glass of lukewarm tap water in the other. He looked pathetic, stripped of his tailored suits, his designer loafers, and his expensive Swiss watches.
He was slapping irritably at his forearm where a mosquito had just landed. He froze when he saw her silhouette in the doorway. He lowered the flashlight, directing the beam at the floor so it wouldn't blind her. "Ellie," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its corporate confidence. "Julian," Eleanor replied, her voice a soft, cool whisper in the dark. Julian took a sip of his water, grimacing at the taste of iron. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. "Look, we've had a rough couple of days. The funeral, the stress, the heat. I know we served you with the notice this morning. I know it seemed harsh." Eleanor didn't answer. She stood near the edge of the shadow, waiting. "But we don't have to make this a war," Julian continued, taking a step toward her. He was trying to sound reasonable, attempting to piece together the fragments of his negotiation skills, but the desperate, frantic look in his eyes betrayed him. "Chloe is a mess. She can't sleep. I can't run my business from a hothouse with no internet. We need to resolve this." "How do you propose we resolve it, Julian?" "Give me the PIN to the primary operating account tomorrow morning," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, confidential register. "Just the PIN. That's all I need to clear the pending transactions and unlock the corporate lines. If you do that, I will write you a personal check right now for $50,000. It's a bridge loan to help you relocate. And when the probate clears, we'll add another $50,000. You won't have to wait 30 days. You can find a beautiful place in the city by the weekend. It's a win-win, Ellie." He looked at her, his face pleading, desperate for a nod of agreement. He was offering her $100,000 of his money, money he believed he possessed, money he believed gave him the power to buy her compliance. Eleanor's internal calculation was instant and cold. The personal checking account from which Julian wanted to write her a $50,000 check was backed by a secondary asset line at the same New York bank that held his frozen corporate guarantor. At exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow, when the bank's automated compliance system processed the formal probate notification she had authorized Howard to send, Julian's personal checking account would be flagged and temporarily restricted for review. Any check he wrote tonight would bounce by tomorrow afternoon. He was trying to buy his comfort with paper that was already worthless. "I cannot help you with the PIN, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly smooth, entirely devoid of anger. Julian's face hardened. The desperate vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the ugly, bitter entitlement of a child
who has been denied his favorite toy. He stepped closer, the heat radiating off his body, his breath smelling faintly of sour whiskey. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You think you're being clever, holding on to these codes, trying to punish us because we didn't visit enough, but it's not going to work. Tomorrow morning, Chloe and I are going to the probate court. We'll file an emergency petition. We'll have a judge order the banks to release the accounts, and we'll have a sheriff escort you off this property by tomorrow afternoon. You won't get 30 days, Ellie. You won't get a single dime. You'll leave this house with nothing but your suitcase and the clothes on your back." Eleanor looked at his pointing finger, then up at his wet, furious face. She felt no fear. She felt only a profound, quiet pity for how little he understood of the world his father had built around him. "I will pack my suitcase, Julian," Eleanor said. She turned and walked back down the dark hallway, her footsteps light and cool on the concrete, leaving him standing alone in the humid, mosquito-infested kitchen, clutching his glass of warm, metallic water. By 11:45 p.m., the air inside the villa was completely stagnant. Julian and Chloe had opened the heavy sliding glass doors at the front and back of the house to create a cross breeze, but the night was dead, without even a whisper of wind. Instead, the humid, heavy night air had crept inside, bringing with it the high-pitched, maddening whine of gnats and mosquitoes. Along with the insects came the unmistakable, sickly sweet stench of the rotting salmon from the gravel driveway, drifting through the open doors and settling into the fabrics of the expensive minimalist furniture. In her dark bedroom, Eleanor lay on top of her sheets. She wore a simple, sleeveless, white cotton nightgown. Despite the heat, she was calm, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Over the years of Arthur's illness, she had learned how to manage her physical responses to discomfort. She had spent countless sweltering summer nights sitting by his bedside when his neurological fever spiked, holding cold compresses to his forehead, her own body slick with sweat, never once complaining. She knew how to find a quiet, cool place inside her own mind. A sharp, metallic clink from the kitchen broke the silence. Eleanor sat up. She slipped her feet into her slippers and walked down the dark hallway. Her movements were entirely silent, a ghost navigating the warm concrete corridors. She reached the kitchen. The moonlight illuminated Julian. He was leaning against the quartz island, dressed only in his boxers and a gray, sweat-soaked t-shirt. He had a flashlight in one hand, its beam cutting a harsh, dusty line through the darkness, and a glass of lukewarm tap water in the other. He looked pathetic, stripped of his tailored suits, his designer loafers, and his expensive Swiss watches. He was slapping irritably at his forearm where a mosquito had just landed. He froze when he saw her silhouette in the doorway. He lowered the flashlight, directing the beam at the floor so it wouldn't blind her. "Ellie," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its corporate confidence. "Julian," Eleanor replied, her voice a soft, cool whisper in the dark. Julian took a sip of his water, grimacing at the taste of iron. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. "Look, we've had a rough couple of days. The funeral, the stress, the heat. I know we served you with the notice this morning. I know it seemed harsh." Eleanor didn't answer. She stood near the edge of the shadow, waiting. But we don't have to make this a war, Julian continued, taking a step toward her. He was trying to sound reasonable, attempting to piece together the fragments of his negotiation skills, but the desperate, frantic look in his eyes betrayed him. Chloe is a mess. She can't sleep. I can't run my business from a hothouse with no internet. We need to resolve this. How do you propose we resolve it, Julian? Give me the PIN to the primary operating account tomorrow morning, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, confidential register. Just the PIN. That's all I need to clear the pending transactions and unlock the corporate lines. If you do that, I will write you a personal check right now for $50,000. It's a bridge loan to help you relocate. And when the probate clears, we'll add another $50,000. You won't have to wait 30 days. You can find a beautiful place in the city by the weekend. It's a win-win, Ellie. He looked at her, his face pleading, desperate for a nod of agreement. He was offering her $100,000 of his money, money he believed he possessed, money he believed gave him the power to buy her compliance. Eleanor's internal calculation was instant and cold. The personal checking account from which Julian wanted to write her a $50,000 check was backed by a secondary asset line at the same New York bank that held his frozen corporate guarantor. At exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow, when the bank's automated compliance system processed the formal probate notification she had authorized Howard to send, Julian's personal checking account would be flagged and temporarily restricted for review. Any check he wrote tonight would bounce by tomorrow afternoon. He was trying to buy his comfort with paper that was already worthless. I cannot help you with the PIN, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice remaining perfectly smooth, entirely devoid of anger. Julian's face hardened. The desperate vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the ugly, bitter entitlement of a child who has been denied his favorite toy. He stepped closer, the heat radiating off his body, his breath smelling faintly of sour whiskey. You're going to regret this, he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at her. You think you're being clever, holding on to these codes, trying to punish us because we didn't visit enough. But it's not going to work. Tomorrow morning, Chloe and I are going to the probate court. We'll file an emergency petition. We'll have a judge order the banks to release the accounts, and we'll have a sheriff escort you off this property by tomorrow afternoon. You won't get 30 days, Ellie. You won't get a single dime. You'll leave this house with nothing but your suitcase and the clothes on your back. Eleanor looked at his pointing finger, then up at his wet, furious face. She felt no fear. She felt only a profound, quiet pity for how little he understood of the world his father had built around him. I will pack my suitcase, Julian, Eleanor said. She turned and walked back down the dark hallway, her footsteps light and cool on the concrete, leaving him standing alone in the humid, mosquito-infested kitchen, clutching his glass of warm, metallic water. By 7:30 a.m., the morning sun was already beating down on the gravel driveway, turning the concrete of the villa into a pale, blinding white. The overnight dampness was evaporating rapidly, leaving the air thick, heavy, and hot. Eleanor stood in front of the mirror in her bathroom. She splashed her face with cold water, the low-pressure tap sputtering slightly before running clear. She dried her face with a crisp linen towel, then reached into her wardrobe. She did not reach for her soft, faded linen shirts or the practical, dark-colored cardigan she had worn during her years of caregiving. Instead, she pulled out a tailored, dark charcoal gray pantsuit. The fabric was heavy, structured, and immaculate. Slipping her arms into the silk-lined sleeves, she felt the familiar, grounding weight of her professional past. It was the first time in 4 years she had dressed this way. She fastened the buttons of the jacket with steady, precise movements. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed repeatedly. The sound of Julian's irritated voice carried up the concrete stairwell. "Chloe, we need to leave now. The traffic near the county courthouse is always a nightmare by 8. If we aren't first in line for the clerk's docket, we won't get the judge's signature before lunch." "I'm coming," Chloe complained, her footsteps heavy and dragging on the stairs. "My skin feels like paper. I didn't sleep for a single hour. There was a giant spider in my bathroom, Julian, a literal wolf spider, because we had to leave the back doors wide open." Eleanor walked down the stairs. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete, a crisp, rhythmic sound that was vastly different from the soft, shuffling slippers she had worn for years. Julian and Chloe stopped in the foyer. Both of them looked battered. Julian's collar was wrinkled, and his face was pale, with dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. Chloe had applied a heavy layer of foundation to hide her exhaustion, but it only made her skin look dry and chalky in the harsh morning light. Julian looked up at Eleanor. His eyes narrowed as he took in her charcoal suit, her professional posture, and the calm, unbothered expression on her face. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle of irritation at how composed she looked compared to how miserable he felt. "We're heading to the courthouse," Julian said, his voice dropping into a flat, hard register. "My legal team in New York has already prepared the petition. We're filing for an emergency administration order. By noon, I will have the court seal that gives me full, unrestricted access to every single account under my father's name. And then we're going to address the locks on this house." Eleanor did not flinch. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. "The courthouse is very busy on Wednesday mornings, Julian. I hope you brought a book." "We won't be waiting," Julian said, his jaw tightening. "I know the senior probate clerk. Now, if I were you, Ellie, I'd spend your morning packing, because when we get back with the sheriff's deputy, I don't want to hear any excuses about why your things are still in our rooms." "I will be ready, Julian," Eleanor said softly. Chloe scoffed, pulling her designer sunglasses down over her eyes to block the bright light of the foyer. "Let's just go, Julian. It's hot and the driveway smells like dead fish. I can't stand another minute of this." They swept out of the house. The heavy glass front door slammed shut, the automatic lock chiming as it engaged. Outside, the SUV's engine roared to life with a loud, aggressive rumble. The tires spun briefly in the loose gravel, kicking up a small cloud of dust before the vehicle sped down the long driveway toward the main gates. The silence that returned to the house was immediate and absolute. Eleanor walked into Arthur's quiet study. She sat in the high-backed leather chair, opened her laptop, and activated her personal cellular hotspot. The signal was strong, bypassing the throttled house router entirely. She opened her email inbox. There was a single unread message from Howard's private address sent 10 minutes ago. It contained a PDF of the pre-filed response of interest and the formal trust notification of asset allocation. "Eleanor," the email read, The filings are prepared. The moment Julian's lawyers present their emergency petition to the probate clerk, the automated system will flag the property and account numbers. The clerk will have no choice but to refer them directly to the trust's legal counsel. We are ready on our end. Let me know when to release the utility transitions." Eleanor typed her reply. "Proceed with the utility transitions immediately. File the trust notices at 10 a.m. I will remain at the property to oversee the transition." She clicked send. With that single click, the first major trap was quietly set in motion. The utility transition was a small clerical detail, but its effects would be devastatingly physical. For years, the electric, water, gas, and waste disposal bills for the massive villa had been billed directly to Eleanor's personal LLC, which she then reimbursed from her private savings to avoid drawing down Arthur's frozen cash reserves. Now she had instructed Howard to formally terminate her LLC's billing responsibility and transfer the accounts directly to the estate of Arthur Vance as of today. Because the estate's primary operating accounts were frozen in probate, the utility company's automated billing systems would immediately flag the accounts for non-payment. Under the local municipal utility code, commercial-grade residential properties in high-risk fire zones were subject to immediate, automated, remote suspension of power and water if a billing transition was rejected by the bank. Within 48 hours, the power to the massive concrete villa would go dark. The water would stop running. The security gates would lock shut on their mechanical overrides. Julian and Chloe believed they were fighting a battle over who owned the house. They had no idea that Eleanor was quietly letting them win the house by stripping it of everything that made it livable, leaving them with nothing but a hot, dark, concrete shell that was rapidly running out of time. By 11:15 a.m., the deep, rhythmic drone of the pool filtration system in the backyard suddenly stopped. The sudden absence of that low-frequency hum was jarring. For 4 years, it had been the baseline white noise of the estate, a constant undercurrent that masked the silence of Arthur's failing body. Now the backyard was dead quiet, save for the faint, dry rustle of the oak leaves in the hot breeze and the slow, crisp click of Eleanor's tablet camera. Eleanor stood in the main gallery hallway, holding her digital tablet. She was conducting a meticulous, room-by-room asset audit. She took 3 high-resolution photographs of each space, 1 wide-angle shot to document the layout, 1 close-up of the custom architectural elements, like the seamless walnut baseboards and the polished travertine flooring, and 1 of the loose, high-end assets. She walked up to the large, abstract canvas hanging in the gallery, the Rothko that Chloe had been so anxious to sell to the gallery in Chelsea. Eleanor stepped behind the floating partition wall, raised her tablet, and took a sharp photograph of the canvas's back frame. Affixed to the dark wood of the stretcher was a small, tamper-proof silver label, Property of the Vance Trust Collection, LLC, registration number 884-A. The painting did not belong to the estate of Arthur Vance. It had been legally transferred to the Trust's holding company 4 years ago, structured as a tax-exempt art preservation vehicle. The siblings could not sell it, they could not borrow against it, and they could not move it. If they tried to take it off the wall, it would trigger a grand larceny notification to the trust's commercial insurance carrier. Eleanor's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a text message from Howard's private secure line. "Emergency probate petition dismissed at 10:42 a.m., the message read. Judge Ramirez ruled that the court lacks immediate jurisdiction over the assets listed in the petition, citing the prior filed trust notice of interest. Julian's New York counsel is currently in a closed room with the clerk, trying to schedule an emergency hearing. The earliest date they can get is next Tuesday. They are panicking." A second later, another notification flashed across her screen. It was a text from Julian. The tone was frantic, stripped of all corporate etiquette, the letters typed in a rush. "Ellie, why is Howard's firm claiming a trust owns the house? What is this garbage? Call me right now. This is a mistake. The house is under Dad's holding company. Call me." Eleanor stared at the message. She calculated the exact speed at which Julian's legal team would begin to untangle the web she and Howard had spent years weaving. His lawyers in New York were highly paid corporate litigators, but they were not trust specialists in this specific jurisdiction. They would have to spend hours, perhaps days, reading through the 300-page trust document to find a single loophole. And every hour they spent billing him at $850 was another hour drawing down his already frozen personal capital. She did not reply. She didn't even slide her thumb to unlock the screen. She simply swiped the notification away, letting the silence of her non-response act as a heavy, psychological weight on his chest. She walked into the guest room that Chloe had been occupying. The room was in complete disarray. Chloe's expensive silk dresses were strewn across the pristine leather armchair, and her luxury makeup cases were open on the travertine vanity, stained cotton pads and dirty wipes scattered across the dark stone. Eleanor raised her tablet. She took a photograph of the clutter. Then she walked over to the custom-carved travertine basin. Near the chrome faucet, there was a small, fresh chip in the delicate stone, a tiny white scar where Chloe must have dropped a heavy glass bottle of facial oil during her frantic morning routine. Eleanor took a macro photograph of the chip. She opened her audit app and logged the damage under Asset Value Depreciation, Using Earnings Item, Liable Item 14. Under the terms of the temporary occupancy agreement Julian had drafted and signed this morning, any tenant who caused damage to the property's physical structure was liable for the immediate, out-of-pocket restoration costs. Julian had inserted that clause to ensure Eleanor wouldn't damage the walls when she moved her furniture out. He had no idea that the clause applied to all occupants, including himself and his sister, and that the trust's restoration contractors billed at premium commercial rates. She finished her log, exited the room, and closed the heavy oak door behind her. As she walked down the stairs, she felt the temperature in the house continuing to climb. It was now 84 degrees in the central foyer. The concrete was acting like a heat sink, absorbing the noon sun and holding it, thick and suffocating. She went to the kitchen, poured herself another glass of tepid water, and sat at the island. She opened her tablet again, pulling up the utility company's automated dashboard. The water company's portal had already updated. The billing transition to the estate of Arthur Vance had been rejected by the automated banking clearinghouse due to account hold status. A bright red alert flashed on the screen. Service disconnection and pending, scheduled for Thursday, 8 a.m. Eleanor took a sip of her water. It tasted flat, warm, and faintly metallic. She liked the taste. It tasted like preparation. It tasted like the slow, inevitable approach of the end. By 2:15 p.m., the temperature inside the villa's upper level had climbed to 86 degrees. Eleanor stood in her bedroom, the dry, ear-splitting screech of brown packing tape echoing off the bare concrete walls as she sealed the top of a cardboard box. She smoothed the tape down with her palm, ensuring the edges were perfectly flat. It was her third box of the afternoon. She had packed only her clothes, her books, and her personal correspondence. She had not touched a single item that belonged to the house, nor had she touched any of the expensive decor Arthur had purchased during their marriage. Outside, the frantic crunch of tires on gravel announced the SUV's return. The vehicle didn't pull into the garage. It came to a sudden, violent halt directly in front of the glass entrance doors. 2 car doors slammed shut, sharp, angry cracks that reverberated through the empty hallways. A moment later, the heavy front door swung open, and the suffocating silence of the house was shattered by Julian's heavy, rapid footsteps storming up the concrete stairs. Chloe followed closely behind, her breath hitching in a wet, frustrated sob. Julian did not knock. He flung Eleanor's bedroom door open so hard the brass handle struck the drywall with a dull, plaster-cracking thud. "What the hell is this, Ellie?" Julian roared. He was shaking. His expensive light blue shirt was completely ruined, dark with sweat, his tie missing, and his face a deep, dangerous purple. He was holding a crumpled sheet of court document in his hand, waving it in her face. "Why didn't you answer my texts? What did you do at the courthouse?" Eleanor did not flinch. She placed the roll of packing tape on top of the sealed box, her hands remaining perfectly still. "I was packing, Julian, as we agreed." "The clerk dismissed our petition," Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a high, desperate panic. "They wouldn't even let my lawyer speak to the judge. The clerk handed us this garbage response from Howard's firm. They're claiming the villa, the holding company, and every single bank account associated with my father's name are owned by an irrevocable trust. They're claiming we have no legal standing to probate the estate because there is no estate to probate. What did you do to him?" "Julian, please," Chloe wept from the doorway, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. She looked miserable, her makeup running in dark, greasy streaks down her sweaty cheeks. "My phone has no signal. The car is out of gas. It's so hot in here. Tell me she's lying. Tell me we still get the Aspen house." Eleanor looked at Chloe, then back to Julian. Her expression was a cool, unyielding wall of indifference. "Your father signed the trust agreement 4 years ago, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice quiet, a stark contrast to his screaming. "Shortly after his diagnosis, when he realized the trajectory of his illness." "He was sick!" Julian shouted, taking a step toward her, his chest heaving. He wasn't in his right mind. You manipulated him. You sat in this house, isolated him from us, and forced him to sign everything over to a sham trust so you could steal our inheritance." "He was entirely lucid," Eleanor said, her tone clinical. "Howard conducted 3 independent capacity evaluations with board-certified neurologists before the documents were finalized. The video recordings of those evaluations, along with his cognitive test scores, are filed in Howard's firm's vault. Your father wanted to ensure his assets were protected." "Protected from what?" Julian hissed. Eleanor looked at his wet, furious face. She thought of the dozens of times she had watched him ask his father for loans to cover his failed investment funds, of the times Chloe had demanded her allowance be wired to her hotels in Paris while Arthur was undergoing painful spinal taps. She did not say those things. To speak them would be to waste her breath on ears that had never listened. "Protected from liquidation," Eleanor said simply. "We're going to sue," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, trembling threat. He shook the crumpled court paper at her. "We'll file a lawsuit to invalidate the trust. We'll claim undue influence. My lawyers in New York are already drafting the complaint. We'll tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. You won't see a single cent of that money." "A lawsuit takes time, Julian," Eleanor said. She picked up a black marker and wrote her name on the top of the box in neat block letters. "And litigation requires liquidity. Your New York firm bills by the hour, does it not?" Julian went entirely still. The implications of her words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his eyes wide, his mouth opening slightly, as he realized the terrifying mathematical reality of his position. He had $3,000 in his checking account. His credit cards were frozen. His corporate guarantor was suspended. He could not pay a retainer for a long-term trust litigation battle. "You," Julian whispered, his voice suddenly losing its volume, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. "You planned this. You've been setting this up the entire time." "I did not plan your father's illness, Julian," Eleanor said, capping the marker with a quiet click. "And I did not plan your lifestyle. I simply managed the structure he put in place." "Julian, what is she saying?" Chloe cried, pulling at her brother's wet sleeve. "What does she mean? Do we not get the money? What about my apartment? What about the Aspen listing?" Julian didn't answer his sister. He couldn't. He was staring at Eleanor as if she were a stranger he had never seen before. Not the quiet, submissive Ellie who had cooked his father's meals and cleaned his father's sheets, but a silent, clinical architect who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. "We still have 30 days, Julian said, his voice shaking as he tried to grasp the last remaining piece of his perceived authority. He pointed to the sealed box on her desk. "We served you with an occupancy termination this morning. You signed it. You have to leave this house. If you don't, we'll have the sheriff remove you." Eleanor looked at the box, then looked up at him, a tiny, faint shadow of a smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I know," Eleanor said softly. "I am packing." By 5:45 p.m., the sun was sinking into a hazy, dust-choked horizon, casting long, bloody red shadows across the polished terrazzo of the gallery. The heat of the day was trapped inside the thick concrete walls, turning the air so stagnant and warm that every breath felt like inhaling steam. Eleanor stood in the darkened study, packing the last of Arthur's personal desk items. She picked up a heavy, solid bronze inkwell that had belonged to his grandfather. The metal was surprisingly cool against her dry palms. She wrapped it carefully in a sheet of white tissue paper and placed it into her leather bag, securing the brass clasp with a soft, clean click. From the living room below, the sound of Julian's voice was growing increasingly hoarse. He was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. Because the house Wi-Fi was practically dead, he was using his phone's cellular hotspot, which was rapidly draining both his battery and his data limits.
Hey, Marcus. Yeah, it's Julian. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Listen, I have a quick, temporary liquidity crunch. Just a standard administrative holdup with my father's estate accounts. I need a quick bridge loan. Just $20,000. A week. 10 days max. No, of course I'll cover the interest. Marcus? Marcus? A heavy silence followed. Julian pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen. He had been hung up on. It was his fourth call in the last hour. The high-flying hedge fund associates, who had happily drunk his father's expensive scotch and joined him on yachts in Monaco, were suddenly very busy, very apologetic, or completely unreachable. The moment they smelled the metallic scent of financial instability, they vanished like mist. Suddenly, a shrill, frantic scream echoed from the upstairs guest bathroom. "Julian! Julian!" Chloe burst out of the guest room, her hair wet and dripping, wrapped in a plush white towel that she had dragged through the dusty hallway. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving, and tears of pure frustration were leaking through her smudged mascara. "Julian, the water!" she wailed, clutching the towel to her chest. "The water just stopped. I was in the middle of washing the conditioner out of my hair, and it went ice cold, and then it turned this horrible, disgusting brown color, and now nothing is coming out. It's just sputtering." Julian ran up the stairs, his face tight. He marched into the hallway bathroom and twisted the handle of the chrome faucet. The pipes behind the concrete wall let out a deep, violent, shuddering thrum, 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 a metallic groan that shook the fixture. A thin, muddy trickle of rusty brown water dribbled from the spout, hissed twice, and then died completely. Julian stared at the dry faucet. He wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead, his breathing shallow. He walked down the hall to Eleanor's room, stopping in the doorway. He looked at the packed leather bag on her desk, then at her face, his eyes dark with a toxic mix of heat exhaustion and fury. "What did you do to the plumbing, Ellie?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you turn off the main water valve?" Eleanor did not stop her packing. She picked up Arthur's leather-bound desk blotter, wiping a speck of dust from the corner with a dry cloth. "The plumbing is fine, Julian." "Then why is there no water?" Julian yelled, his composure fracturing completely. "It's 88 degrees in this house. We can't flush the toilets. My sister has soap in her hair, and you're sitting here packing boxes like nothing is happening. Turn the water back on." "The water pressure in this villa is maintained by an electric booster pump in the basement mechanical room," Eleanor said, her voice cool and steady, like a draft of fresh air in the sweltering room.
The concrete structure is too tall and sits too high on the hill for the municipal line pressure to reach the upper floor bathrooms on its own. It requires the pump. "Well, where is the pump switch?" Julian demanded, taking a step into her room. "Where is the breaker?" "The pump is integrated into the primary smart home automation grid," Eleanor said. "When the network transitioned to the restricted diagnostic mode this morning, the auxiliary pumps were automatically powered down to prevent electrical overload during the updates." "Give me the password to the administrator portal," Julian hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm not asking you nicely anymore, Ellie. Give me the password. I'm the executor of this estate. I have the legal right to control the utilities." "The administrator portal is registered to my consulting company, Julian," Eleanor said, placing the desk blotter into her cardboard box. "It is not an estate asset. And as you pointed out this morning, my relationship with the estate's daily operations has ceased. I am not legally permitted to utilize my corporate resources to manage your property." Julian stared at her, his jaw working as he tried to find a legal counter, a threat, anything that could break her absolute clinical calm. But there was nothing. She was using his own words, his own formal notice, to systematically starve him of the very resources he needed to survive the night. "We'll find the physical valve," Julian muttered, turning away, his voice shaking. "We'll go down to the basement and override the system ourselves. Come on, Chloe." "In the dark?" Chloe sobbed, clutching her wet, soapy hair. "Julian, it's pitch black down there. There are spiders." "I have a flashlight," Julian snapped, storming toward the stairs. "Just shut up and follow me." Eleanor watched them go. She knew they would spend the next 2 hours in the damp, labyrinthine concrete basement, swatting at cobwebs and screaming at the dark, searching for a manual bypass valve that didn't exist. The basement mechanical room was locked behind a heavy steel fire door that required a digital keycard, a keycard that was currently sitting at the bottom of Eleanor's leather bag. And even if they managed to break the door down, they would find nothing but digital solenoids and computerized manifolds that could not be operated by hand. She walked to her window and looked out. The sun had set completely now, leaving the estate wrapped in a thick, velvety darkness. The high-pitched electric hum of the cicadas in the surrounding woods was peaking, a deafening wall of sound that drowned out the quiet groans of the sweltering house. From the driveway below, the breeze shifted, carrying the thick, oily, unmistakable stench of the decaying salmon directly through the open sliding doors of the living room. Eleanor took a deep breath of the warm, heavy air. She went back to her desk, sat down, and began to pack her books, her fingers moving in perfect rhythmic harmony with the dark. By 10:15 p.m., the flashlight batteries Julian had used to search the dark basement began to die, the beam shifting from a sharp, clinical white to a dull, sickly yellow that barely cut through the shadows. The heavy basement fire door had indeed remained locked. Julian and Chloe had spent nearly 2 hours in the hot, dusty lower corridors of the villa, the metallic clatter of their search echoing up through the concrete vents. Julian had even tried to strike the steel fire door with a rusted iron pipe he found in the utility closet, achieving nothing but a series of deafening, ear-splitting clangs that vibrated through the columns of the house before leaving them in a thick, choking cloud of disturbed drywall dust. They finally emerged back into the living room, completely defeated. Julian's blue shirt was torn at the shoulder, smeared with gray concrete dust and black grease from the pipes. His face was a mask of sweat and soot, his eyes wild and bloodshot. Chloe sat on the bottom step of the concrete staircase, her head resting on her knees. Her damp, soapy hair had dried in the stagnant 88-degree heat into a stiff, sticky nest that clung to her neck. She was too exhausted to cry, her shoulders only flinching occasionally as she swatted at the mosquitoes that buzzed around her face. The smell of the decaying salmon from the driveway had fully invaded the house, thick, oily, and heavy, settling into the minimalist linen drapes and the raw concrete walls like a permanent stain. In her bedroom, Eleanor performed her final physical routine of the night. She stood at her vanity, carefully wrapping a small, silver-framed photograph of Arthur. She used a soft microfiber cloth to wipe the glass, removing a tiny smudge of grease from the corner before placing it gently between two soft wool sweaters in her suitcase. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window.
Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, steady, and entirely untroubled by the heat or the chaotic silence of the house. A shadow fell across her doorway. Julian stood there, leaning heavily against the frame. He was panting, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gaps. He didn't scream this time. He didn't have the breath for it. His voice was a low, raspy growl, dripping with a quiet, venomous hatred. "You think you've won, Ellie," Julian said, his eyes tracking the neat, orderly rows of boxes on her floor. "You think because you changed the passwords and lock the doors, you can starve us out of our own father's house. You think we're just going to pack up and leave because it's hot." Eleanor did not turn around to face him. She adjusted the corner of the sweater in her suitcase. "I do not think in terms of winning, Julian." "Tomorrow morning," Julian hissed, his hand gripping the wood of the doorframe so hard his dirty knuckles turned white. 9 o'clock. My lawyers are filing an emergency appeal directly with the presiding judge of the probate court. We're bypassing the clerk's office entirely. I don't care what Howard's trust filings say. A judge is not going to let a stepmother lock his children out of a $50 million estate because of a technicality. We will have a court order to drill every lock in this house by noon. And then I am personally throwing your boxes into the gravel next to the rotting fish." He stood there for a moment, waiting for her to defend herself, to plead, or to offer a compromise. But Eleanor remained silent, her back to him, her hands resting quietly on the edge of her open suitcase. With a low, frustrated curse, Julian turned and dragged his heavy, dusty loafers down the hallway toward the guest wing, his bedroom door shutting with a hollow, echoing thud. Eleanor slowly turned and looked at the small digital clock on her nightstand. It was 10:45 p.m. She sat down at her desk, opened her tablet, and looked at the automated schedules she had verified with Howard earlier. At 8 a.m. tomorrow, the municipal water main would shut off.
The smart valve would close, and the remaining water in the pipes would drain completely. At 9 a.m., the bank's automated compliance system would process the formal probate hold, freezing Julian's remaining personal checking accounts and rejecting his credit cards. At 10 a.m., the county sheriff's department would receive the formal notice of foreclosure and trust eviction from Howard's office. Because the holding company had defaulted on the mortgage held by the trust had the legal right to immediate possession of the property. The sheriff would not be arriving to help Julian drill the locks. They would be arriving to serve the physical eviction notice to the estate of Arthur Vance and its temporary occupants. Julian and Chloe believed they were giving Eleanor 30 days to pack her things. They had no idea that they had less than 12 hours before the legal and physical walls of the estate would close around them, locking them out of the house, the accounts, and the wealth they had spent their entire lives taking for granted. Eleanor closed her tablet, slid it into her leather bag, and latched the suitcase shut. The heavy metallic click of the latch was loud in the dark, sweltering room, the sound of the lock finally turning on the vault. At 7:45 a.m., the sun was already a blinding, white-hot disk climbing over the trees, turning the brutalist concrete walls of the villa into a massive, heat-radiating kiln. Eleanor sat at the long concrete dining table. She was fully dressed in her tailored charcoal gray pantsuit, her hair pinned back in an immaculate tight bun. By her feet sat her leather briefcase, and stacked neatly by the heavy glass front door were her 3 cardboard boxes and her leather suitcase. She held a glass of cool, clear water. She had anticipated the water shut-off and had kept a private case of imported mineral water locked inside her wardrobe. She took a slow, measured sip, her hand perfectly steady, watching the digital numbers on her phone flip from 7:59 to 8 o'clock. Deep within the foundation of the house, a faint, heavy clank vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of the municipal main line's motorized smart valve closing, shutting off the water flow to the estate completely. From upstairs, a door slammed, followed by the frantic slapping sound of Chloe's bare feet on the concrete steps. She stumbled into the dining gallery, and she looked like a ghost. Her silk robe was stained with sweat and gray basement dust, her skin chalky and dry, her hair a stiff, tangled nest from the dried conditioner. She ran straight to the kitchen sink and violently twisted the chrome faucet. Nothing happened. Not a drop of water, not even a sigh of trapped air in the pipes. "Julian!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking, high and hysterical. "Julian, there's nothing. It's completely gone. Not even the brown trickle. I can't even brush my teeth." Julian came down the stairs. He was wearing his wrinkled trousers from yesterday, his t-shirt stained with black pipe grease from his night in the basement. He looked hollowed out, his eyes bloodshot, his face covered in a light, sweaty sheen of desperation. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed the faucet handle, and wrenched it back and forth. The metal squeaked in the dry silence. Julian slowly turned his head. His gaze drifted across the sweltering dark room until it landed on Eleanor. He saw her immaculate suit. He saw her packed boxes by the door. And then his eyes locked onto the glass of clear, cold water sitting on the table in front of her. A dark, dangerous shift occurred in his expression. The last remaining threads of his corporate composure, his expensive education, and his manufactured politeness snapped. The heat, the lack of sleep, and the sudden, terrifying realization of his own powerlessness had driven him into a primal, desperate rage. He walked out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing like hammer blows on the terrazzo. He stopped directly across the table from her, his chest heaving. "You did this," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a violent, unstable energy. "You shut the main valve. You're trying to force us out." "The municipal water company shut the valve, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice remaining low, cool, and flat. "The billing transition to the estate was rejected by the clearinghouse at 8 o'clock. The automated system acted accordingly." "You're lying," Julian roared, his hands slamming down on the concrete table with a crack that echoed off the high ceiling. "You're a thief! You sat in this house and bled my father dry while he was dying, and now you're trying to steal our birthright. You're going to turn that water back on, and you're going to give me the login codes to the bank accounts right now." "I do not have the authority to manage those accounts, Julian," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on his. In a flash of pure, unbridled fury, Julian reached across the table. His hand grabbed her glass of mineral water and hurled it violently across the room. The glass struck the raw concrete pillar behind the kitchen island and shattered with a loud, explosive smash. Shards of crystal sprayed across the polished floor, and the cold water splashed down the concrete, leaving a dark, weeping stain on the wall. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. But she didn't step forward to stop him. She was too desperate, too broken by the heat and the thirst to care about the violence. Julian took 2 rapid steps around the table, stepping over the shattered glass, and closed the distance between them. He stood directly over Eleanor, his tall frame blocking the bright morning light, his face inches from hers. He smelled of sweat, sour whiskey, and the heavy stench of the rotting fish from the driveway. "I'm going to ask you one last time, Ellie," Julian hissed, his finger pointing directly into her face, his hand shaking with the urge to grab her. "Give me your phone. Give me the administrator codes, or I swear to God, I will physically throw you out of this house myself. I'll throw your boxes into the dirt, and I'll let you rot out there with the garbage." He had crossed the line. The threats of legal eviction, the corporate posturing, and the passive-aggressive maneuvers were gone. He had entered the territory of physical intimidation, property destruction, and direct assault. Eleanor sat perfectly still. She did not flinch from his pointing finger. She did not shrink back from the smell of his sweat or the venom in his voice. Instead, she slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Her dark gaze was clinical, assessing him not as a stepson, but as a liability that had finally executed its own ruin. In her pocket, her phone was already recording. The audio of his threat, the sound of the glass shattering against the wall, and the heavy, violent thud of his hand on the table had been captured in high definition, streaming directly to the secure server she shared with Howard. "The boxes are already packed, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice a whisper of absolute, chilling certainty. "You won't have to throw them." Julian's chest heaved, his ragged, desperate breathing the loudest sound in the vast, stifling gallery. He stood frozen, his eyes wide, his hand still trembling from the violent arc of throwing the glass. He was waiting for her to scream, to shrink back, to give him some sign that his physical size and his raw aggression had broken through her composure. Eleanor did not move a single muscle in her face. She slowly stood up from the concrete table. She did not look at the dark, weeping water stain on the concrete pillar behind him, nor did she look at the sparkling shards of crystal scattered across the polished terrazzo. She adjusted her dark charcoal jacket, smoothing the lapels with her raw, dry fingertips, and picked up her leather briefcase from the seat beside her. She took a step forward. Julian remained in her path, his body tense, his jaw clenched, as if he intended to block her physically. But Eleanor did not slow down, and she did not swerve. She walked directly toward him, her eyes fixed on his, with a cold, clinical detachment that was more terrifying than any defensive outburst. As she closed the distance, Julian's corporate instincts, the part of him that was entirely unaccustomed to physical violence or raw, unscripted confrontation, faltered. Faced with a woman who treated him not as a physical threat, but as a minor, predictable administrative error, his confidence broke. He took a single, involuntary step backward. It was only an inch, but it was the defining retreat. Eleanor walked past him, the sole of her polished leather shoe making a sharp, clean crunch as she stepped directly onto a large shard of the shattered crystal. She didn't look down. "Julian, don't," Chloe whispered from the kitchen doorway. Her voice was thin, reedy, and shaking with a sudden, deep-seated terror. "Julian, stop! She isn't scared. Why isn't she scared?" Julian didn't answer his sister. He couldn't. He stood in the center of the gallery, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his face covered in a greasy film of sweat and concrete dust, looking like a man who had thrown his heaviest punch, only to find the wall was made of solid granite. At exactly 9 a.m., the phone in Julian's pocket began to vibrate. It was not a phone call. It was a series of rapid, sharp, high-pitched notification chimes that echoed off the high ceiling of the foyer. Julian pulled the phone from his pocket, his dirty thumb frantically swiping the screen. His eyes darted across the glowing display, and as he read, the sweaty purple color of his face drained away, leaving his skin a dull, ashen gray. "No," Julian whispered, his fingers shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. "No, no, no! This is a mistake." He tapped the screen repeatedly, trying to force his banking application to load, but the screen only spun, a tiny digital wheel of death, before throwing a flat red banner across the display. Access denied. Account status restricted, pending trustee audit. The automated compliance notification from his private bank was explicit. Urgent notice, personal line of credit, ending in 4492, has been restricted under standard trust guarantor safety protocols. All associated depository and transaction accounts have been temporarily locked pending formal estate/trust reconciliation. "What is this?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate, hollow whine as he spun around to face Eleanor, who was now standing by the heavy front door near her packed boxes. "What did you do? How do you have the power to freeze my personal bank account?" Eleanor stopped. She adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, her voice remaining low, cool and flat. I do not have the power to freeze your personal accounts, Julian. Then why am I locked out? Julian cried, taking a frantic step toward her, holding the phone out as if the screen itself were an accusation. The bank says the line of credit is restricted under trust protocols. That line of credit is in my name. It is in your name, Eleanor said, but the guarantor of that line is Vance Holdings, and Vance Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Irrevocable Trust. When the trust filed the formal notice of trustee priority at 10 minutes past 10 yesterday, the bank's compliance division was legally obligated to flag all personal liabilities guaranteed by the corporate parent. They are protecting their collateral from your personal insolvency. Julian stared at her, his mouth hanging open. My personal insolvency? I'm not insolvent. I have assets. You have a highly leveraged hedge fund that has not returned a dividend in 18 months, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice clinical, stating the facts as if she were reading a corporate ledger. You have an $8,000 a month rental in Manhattan that is currently in arrears, and you have 2 leased luxury vehicles. Your entire lifestyle was subsidized by the corporate operating card, which has been deactivated. You have exactly $3,000 in liquid cash, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, that account is frozen to offset the trust's liability. Julian's phone slipped from his hand. It struck the terrazzo floor with a sharp plastic clunk, sliding a few inches before coming to a stop near the shattered glass. Chloe let out a long, pathetic sob, her knees giving out as she slid down the wall, her wet, sticky hair clinging to the concrete as she wept. Julian, please, what are we going to do? I don't have any money. I can't even buy a bottle of water. Julian didn't look at his sister. He was staring at Eleanor, his breathing shallow, his face twisted in a look of complete, unadulterated shock. For his entire life, the world had been a place of frictionless ease, where his father's money was a constant, invisible safety net that caught him every time he fell. Now the net was gone. The water was gone. The money was gone. And the woman they had spent the last 24 hours trying to evict was standing by the door, her hands folded neatly over her briefcase, waiting for the final act to begin. By 9:45 a.m., the heat radiating off the concrete driveway had reached a blistering 92 degrees. The stagnant air shimmered in waves over the gravel, thick with the heavy, sickening stench of the decaying salmon that had been baking in the direct sun for over 24 hours. Eleanor stood inside the tinted glass front doors of the foyer. Her fingers rested lightly on the handle of her leather suitcase, her eyes fixed on the long, winding driveway. Behind her, the massive concrete halls of the villa were completely silent, holding the thick, humid heat like a tomb. Suddenly, a loud metallic clank echoed from the end of the property. The massive black iron gates, which had been locked shut since the power transition, began to swing slowly inward on their mechanical hinges. Julian, who was slumped on the concrete floor of the gallery, his face smeared with soot, his head resting against the wall, sat up instantly. His eyes went wide as he heard the gates. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs as a sudden, desperate surge of hope washed over his face. "Chloe!" Julian gasped, his voice cracking. He ran toward the foyer, his sweaty T-shirt sticking to his chest. "Chloe, get up! The gates are opening. The New York team must have bypassed the automated block. They got the emergency petition signed. The court sent someone." Chloe stumbled out of the living room, her face pale and greasy, clutching her silk robe around her as she peered through the glass. "Is it the police? Julian, please tell me they're here to turn the water back on." Through the shimmering heat waves of the driveway, 2 vehicles rolled up the gravel. The first was a sleek, black luxury sedan. The second was a white, heavy-duty SUV with the stark blue and gold emblem of the county sheriff emblazoned on the side. The vehicles came to a stop directly in front of the villa's entrance, their engines idling with a low, deep rumble that sent waves of hot exhaust into the air. The driver of the sedan stepped out first. It was Howard. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray 3-piece suit that was entirely impervious to the sweltering heat. He held a thick, dark brown leather portfolio under his arm. From the patrol vehicle, a tall, uniformed sheriff's deputy stepped out, his heavy-duty belt clinking with handcuffs, a radio, and a sidearm. Both men immediately grimaced, pulling their collars up as the overwhelming stench of the rotting fish hit them. Julian violently pushed the heavy glass front door open, stepping out onto the concrete veranda. He looked wild, his hair standing in greasy spikes, his hands black with pipe grease, his voice rising in a frantic, demanding screech. "Officer, thank God you're here," Julian yelled, pointing a trembling, dirty finger back toward the house. "This woman, our stepmother, she has locked us out of our own property. She's cut off the water, sabotaged the high-speed lines, and locked the basement mechanical rooms. I am the legal executor of this estate, and I want her removed for trespassing immediately." The deputy did not move. He did not unholster his cuffs, and he did not look at Eleanor. He simply looked at Julian, then at Chloe, who was shivering in her stained robe despite the 92-degree heat. Howard stepped around a puddle of melting water from the spoiled delivery boxes, his leather shoes making a soft, crunching sound on the gravel. He opened his portfolio, his expression a cold, clinical mask of professional pity. "Julian," Howard said, his voice carrying clearly over the rumble of the car engines. "Chloe." Julian blinked, his brow furrowing as he looked at the old lawyer. "Howard, what is this? Did you bring the probate files? Tell this officer to get her out of the house so we can drill the locks."
"I am here in my capacity as chief legal counsel for the Vance Irrevocable Trust," Howard said, pulling a heavy white document with a bright red court seal from his portfolio. "And Deputy Miller is here to execute a formal emergency writ of possession issued by the presiding judge of the State Superior Court at 9:15 this morning." Julian's face went entirely blank. "A writ of possession? For what? This is my father's house. I'm the heir." "The house did not belong to your father, Julian," Howard said, his voice flat and unyielding. "The title of this villa, along with the properties in Aspen and Tuscany, was held by Vance Holdings, LLC. 3 years ago, the Vance Irrevocable Trust purchased the primary mortgage on all 3 properties to prevent a commercial default when your father's medical expenses began to freeze his liquid assets." Howard paused, letting the legal reality of his words settle in the hot, stagnant air. "Because the estate of Arthur Vance has defaulted on the monthly mortgage service, due to the probate court's automatic freeze on the operating accounts, the trust has exercised its legal right of immediate foreclosure. The trust has taken physical possession of this villa, as well as the Aspen and Tuscany estates,
effective as of 9 o'clock this morning. Julian took a step back, his foot catching on the door frame. No, that's a lie. The trust is a family trust. We're the beneficiaries. We inherit the trust assets. You are the beneficiaries of the probate will, Julian, Howard corrected him, his eyes cold, which currently consists of $4 million in outstanding medical liabilities to the Munich clinic, 2 active federal tax liens, and an empty corporate bank account. You are not listed anywhere on the trust registry. Chloe let out a sharp, choked sob, her hands flying to her face as she looked at the red seal on the document in Howard's hand. Julian, what is he saying? We don't get the houses? We don't get anything? Who is the beneficiary of the trust, Howard? Julian whispered, his voice cracking, losing all its strength, his chest collapsing as the entire weight of his financial ruin pressed down on him. Who holds the power? Howard turned his head slightly, looking past Julian's shoulder toward the glass doors of the foyer. Eleanor stepped out onto the concrete veranda. She carried her leather briefcase, her charcoal gray suit pristine, her face completely calm. She stood beside Howard, her dark eyes looking down at her stepchildren with a quiet, devastating silence. Eleanor Vance is the sole trustee, the sole executing officer, and the sole lifetime beneficiary of the Vance Irrevocable Trust, Howard said. The deputy stepped forward, his heavy leather boots crunching on the gravel as he handed the red-sealed document to Julian. Mr. Vance? Miss Vance? The deputy said, his voice firm and empty of sympathy. I am executing a court-ordered eviction of all unauthorized occupants of this property. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still on the property at 10:15, you will be arrested for criminal trespass. Julian looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the red seal. Then he looked up at Eleanor, his eyes filling with hot, angry tears of complete, desperate defeat. Beside him, Chloe sank to her knees on the dirty concrete, weeping hysterically, her hands clawing at her sweat-stained robe as she realized the true, terrifying scale of the woman she had tried to throw out. The next 15 minutes passed in a frantic, suffocating blur of heat, sweat, and absolute panic. Inside the sweltering villa, the quiet order Eleanor had maintained for 4 years was instantly replaced by the chaotic, desperate sounds of the siblings scrambling to strip their rooms of whatever they could carry. The temperature in the upstairs gallery had reached 94 degrees, and the air was thick, wet, and heavy. In the guest room, Chloe was on her knees on the dusty travertine floor. She was shoving unwashed silk dresses, half-empty cosmetic bottles, and loose designer shoes into her massive leather suitcases. She was weeping hysterically, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every few seconds she would wipe her sweaty forehead with her arm, leaving dark streaks of gray concrete dust and mascara across her face. Her damp, stiff hair clung to her neck like a heavy collar. Julian's bedroom was no better. He was frantically throwing his laptop, chargers, and wrinkled shirts into a nylon duffel bag. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his phone charger twice, the plastic plug clattering loudly against the concrete floor. He kept looking toward the door, where Deputy Miller stood, leaning casually against the frame, his hand resting near his heavy-duty belt. 5 minutes, folks, the deputy said, his voice a flat municipal drone that offered no room for negotiation. Make sure you've got your IDs and your medication. Once we seal the door, you aren't coming back inside." Julian zipped the duffel bag with a violent, desperate yank that caught the fabric of a shirt, tearing it. He ignored it, slinging the heavy bag over his shoulder. He picked up his primary suitcase, the weight of it pulling his shoulder down. He looked like a beaten man, his chest collapsed, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of soot and defeat. "Chloe, let's go," Julian muttered, his voice hollow, stripped of all its earlier corporate thunder. "We have to go." They descended the concrete stairs together, their heavy suitcases banging loudly against the walnut handrails with a succession of dull wooden thuds. Eleanor stood on the front veranda beside Howard, her dark gray suit immaculate, her hands folded neatly over her leather briefcase. She watched them emerge from the house. She did not gloat. She did not offer a single word of mockery. She simply watched them with the cold, clinical gaze of a scientist observing the final, predictable reaction of a chemical compound. Julian dragged his suitcase through the glass doors, stopping on the concrete veranda. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his eyes, staring at the black SUV parked on the gravel. "We'll take the rental," Julian said, his voice shaking as he looked at Howard. "We'll drive to the station in town and get our bank accounts sorted out. My lawyers in New York will have this cleared up by this afternoon." Howard did not look up from his leather portfolio. "The rental agency has already been notified of the credit hold on the corporate account, Julian. The authorization was officially declined at 9:30. The agency's local dispatch has already dispatched a flatbed to reclaim the vehicle for non-payment." Julian's eyes went wide. He gripped the handle of his suitcase so hard his knuckles turned white. "What? You're going to strand us here? We're on a private estate. It's 5 miles to the nearest highway." "The private road is exactly 2 miles long," Howard said, his voice calm and precise. "There is a public transit stop at the bottom of the hill, right where the private gravel meets the state highway. The bus runs every 45 minutes. "A bus?" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking as she clutched her massive, overpacked leather suitcases. She looked down at her delicate designer sandals, which were already covered in gray gravel dust. "Julian, I can't walk 2 miles in these. My bags weigh 50 pounds each. We have to call an Uber." "With what credit card, Chloe?" Julian snapped, his voice tight with a sudden, vicious wave of panic. "With what phone data? The network is throttled. We don't have a signal." Chloe looked at her phone screen, which indeed displayed a flat, single bar of cellular strength and no data connection. She let out a long, pathetic wail, sinking onto her suitcases, her dirty silk robe dragging in the gravel. 10:15, Deputy Miller said, stepping out onto the veranda and pulling a heavy yellow security seal from his pocket. He looked at Julian and Chloe. "Time's up, folks. Please step off the concrete." Julian looked at Eleanor. He searched her face for some speck of familiarity, some lingering trace of the quiet, accommodating Ellie who had nursed his father, who had washed his father's clothes, who had taken his verbal abuse for years without a word. But there was nothing. Her eyes were dark, deep, and completely vacant of pity. She had spent 4 years performing the invisible, uncompensated labor that kept their luxurious world running, and now that she had withdrawn her hands, the entire structure had collapsed around them. "Come on, Chloe," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. He grabbed his sister by her sweaty arm, dragging her to her feet. They stepped off the concrete veranda, their heavy leather suitcases crunching loudly into the loose gravel. Eleanor watched them walk down the long, sweeping driveway. Chloe was sobbing, her delicate sandals slipping in the dirt, her massive designer bags dragging heavily behind her, kicking up small clouds of white dust that clung to her sweat-slicked legs. Julian walked beside her, his shoulders slouched, carrying his heavy duffel. His head hung low as the blazing morning sun beat down on his wet back. They had to step directly around the rotting, fly-infested boxes of salmon on the driveway, the thick, oily stench of their own ignored privilege rising up to choke them as they began their long, dusty walk down the hill. Eleanor slowly turned her back to the driveway. She walked into the cool, shadowed foyer of the villa, her polished shoes silent on the terrazzo, while Howard and the deputy prepared to apply the formal trust seals to the glass doors behind her. By 11 a.m., the sound of the siblings dragging suitcases had faded entirely, swallowed by the heavy electric hum of the cicadas in the surrounding pine woods. The long, winding gravel driveway lay empty, shimmering under the white glare of the midday sun. Inside the foyer, the air was still 88 degrees, thick with stagnant dust and the lingering sweet scent of decay from the driveway. Eleanor stood quietly in the center of the gallery. She reached into her leather briefcase, her fingers brushing past Arthur's silver-framed photograph, and pulled out a thin blue plastic keycard. She walked down the long, raw, concrete hallway to the basement entrance. She swiped the card across the digital reader on the heavy steel fire door. The small LED light flashed from red to a steady, solid green with a quiet, pressurized click. She pushed the door open and descended the cool concrete stairs into the mechanical heart of the house. The basement was vast, filled with the clean, metallic smell of copper pipes and industrial electrical boxes. She approached the central automation panel, its glass touchscreen glowing in the dim light. With slow, practiced movements, she entered her personal administrative bypass code. Immediately, the massive electric booster pump in the corner hummed to life, a deep, throaty whir click that vibrated through the concrete foundation. The main water solenoid clicked open, and the faint, rushing sound of pressurized water surged through the pipes, rising toward the upper levels of the villa. She touched the screen again, navigating to the climate control settings. She deactivated seasonal conservation mode and set the thermostat to a crisp, steady 66 degrees. The massive auxiliary compressors outside the eastern wing roared to life, their powerful fans beginning to spin with a low, distant rumble. Eleanor walked back up the stairs, closing the heavy fire door behind her. As she re-entered the kitchen, the first draft of cool, conditioned air began to whisper from the minimalist vents in the high ceiling, instantly pushing the heavy, hot dust toward the open sliding doors. She walked to the quartz island and twisted the chrome kitchen faucet. The pipes let out a soft, satisfied hiss before a thick, perfectly clear stream of cold, filtered water surged into the sink. She filled her glass to the brim. The water was icy, sparkling, and completely pure. She took a slow, quiet sip, feeling the coldness settle deep inside her chest. Howard was sitting at the long concrete dining table, his tablet open in front of him. The high-speed network had restored itself instantly, and the screen displayed the updated legal registry of the Vance Irrevocable Trust. "The digital filings are complete, Eleanor," Howard said, sliding a sleek digital stylus across the clean table. "The court has formally updated the title registry. The estate of Arthur Vance has been declared insolvent under the weight of the Munich Clinic liabilities. The holding company is dissolved, and the trust has assumed absolute, unencumbered ownership of the villa, the Aspen Lodge, and the estate in Tuscany." He looked up at her, a faint professional smile touching his eyes. "You are the sole executing trustee and the sole lifetime beneficiary. The children have no legal standing to appeal. The corporate counsel in New York has already closed their file." Eleanor took the digital pen. She signed her name at the bottom of the screen, Eleanor Vance. Her handwriting was small, precise, and completely unhurried. "What are your plans for the properties?" Howard asked, closing his portfolio with a soft, leather-bound snap. "We will list the Aspen and Tuscany estates next week," Eleanor said, her voice a calm, steady hum in the cooling room. "The proceeds will go directly into the Medical Research Foundation Arthur and I established last year. As for this house, I will have a commercial cleaning crew here tomorrow morning to remove the spoiled deliveries from the driveway and sanitize the guest rooms. And then? And then I will live here," Eleanor said softly. "It is very quiet when the machines run properly." Howard nodded, standing up and adjusting his jacket. "It is. Arthur would be very pleased with how you handled this, Eleanor. He knew exactly who held the power to preserve what he built." "He did," Eleanor agreed. She walked with Howard to the front doors. Deputy Miller had already applied the heavy, yellow security seals to the side entrances, and he gave Eleanor a respectful, polite nod as he walked back to his patrol vehicle. Outside, a massive flatbed tow truck was slowly backing up the gravel driveway, its yellow hazard lights flashing lazily in the heat. It stopped directly in front of the black rental SUV. Within minutes, the driver had hooked the vehicle to the winch, pulling it onto the steel bed with a loud, metallic screech of chains. Julian's and Chloe's temporary refuge was gone. Eleanor stood on the concrete veranda, her glass of cold water in her hand, watching the flatbed truck roll back down the driveway and through the massive iron gates, which slowly swung shut behind it, locking the world outside. She looked down the long, empty gravel road that wound through the pines. Miles away, near the state highway, under the blistering 94-degree sun, two tiny, dusty figures were likely still walking, their hands raw from dragging their heavy designer suitcases, their pockets empty, their status completely shattered. They had cried, seeing who actually held the power. But their tears had changed nothing. The cool air of the villa's air conditioning brushed against the back of Eleanor's neck, fresh and clean. She stepped backward, crossing the threshold into the quiet, pristine gallery. The heavy glass front doors slid closed in front of her, the automatic deadbolts engaging with a soft, final click, sealing her inside the silence of her absolute, unyielding victory. By 4 p.m., the long shadow of the concrete pergola had stretched across the veranda, cooling the raw concrete floor of the foyer. The The high-capacity air conditioning system had successfully brought the interior temperature down to a crisp, silent 65 degrees. The stagnant, heavy scent of the afternoon had been entirely replaced by the clean, sterile smell of chilled air. Eleanor sat at Arthur's heavy mahogany desk in the quiet study. The room was cool now, washed in the soft, blue-gray light of the late afternoon. On the polished wood surface lay the final, leather-bound portfolio she had retrieved from the master safe. It was not a document about the villa, nor was it the deeds to the European vacation homes. It was a folder labeled simply, Project Balance. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside sat a series of legal notices, debt assignment contracts, and certified banking registries dating back 24 months. Her finger traced the signature at the bottom of the first page. It was Julian's handwriting, frantic and bold, signed during a period when his private hedge fund had been on the verge of a highly publicized, catastrophic collapse. Julian had believed a private, anonymous offshore institution had bought out his outstanding personal liabilities and margin calls to save his reputation. He had never known the identity of that offshore institution. He had simply assumed it was a standard venture capital rescue. In reality, the offshore entity was a shell company wholly owned by the Vance Irrevocable Trust.
Arthur had not merely protected his wealth from his children. He had quietly, systematically bought their debts. He had done it while he was still lucid, sitting in his wheelchair, looking out at the gardens. He had realized that his children's greed would eventually destroy them, and he wanted to ensure that when the time came, the leash would be held by someone who knew how to use it. Eleanor turned to the last page of the registry. Julian's total outstanding personal debt to the trust stood at $7.4 million. Under the strict terms of the default clauses he had signed, the trustee had the legal right to immediate, non-judicial foreclosure on all of his remaining personal assets, including his Manhattan loft lease, his remaining corporate equities, and any future earnings he might generate. A quiet chime echoed from her tablet. A new email from Howard's personal address had arrived. Eleanor, the message read, the foreclosure notices on Julian's personal holdings in New York have been finalized and filed with the county clerk. The marshals will begin the physical asset seizure of his Manhattan apartment at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He will have no address, no liquid funds, and no corporate backup. The ledger is officially balanced. Eleanor stared at the screen. She did not smile. She did not feel a sudden rush of warmth or a sense of triumphant joy. Her reaction was entirely quiet, a deep, slow breath that expanded her chest before leaving her in a state of absolute metabolic rest. She closed the leather portfolio, placing it neatly back into her leather briefcase. Julian and Chloe had spent years treating her as an invisible, disposable resource, entirely blind to the quiet, meticulous labor that kept their lives from falling apart. They had arrived at the funeral expecting to execute a swift, arrogant eviction, believing their bloodline gave them an inherent, untouchable right to rule. They had cried when they finally saw who held the power. But they still had not realized the full depth of their descent. Tomorrow morning, when Julian reached the city, he would find that his keys no longer worked. His belongings were on the street, and every dollar he owed was owned
by the very stepmother he had tried to throw into the dirt. The universe had a way of balancing its accounts. It did not happen with a loud explosion or a dramatic display of anger. It happened in the quiet, clinical turning of a page, in the automated shut-off of a valve, and in the silent, unyielding execution of a contract. In the end, the scales of justice always find their equilibrium. Every hidden act of entitlement, every silent sacrifice, and every calculated betrayal eventually meets its exact, unavoidable recompense. That is the raw, quiet truth of karma. It does not miss a single ledger. If you found this story of quiet calculation, absolute patience, and ultimate justice deeply satisfying, make sure to subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we explore the deep psychological chess matches of life, where the arrogant are brought to their knees by the very people they overlooked, and the silent architects of justice take back what is rightfully theirs. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Absolute Reckoning, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on Eleanor's final, devastating move. Until the next ledger balances, keep watching the scales.